Lightning rips open the black sky. Thunder cracks like gunfire across the Nevada Territory. 1882. A man stands alone between the rain and the fists. Two riders close in. One wrong blow. A body sinks into the mud. Why was no body ever found? Rain turns the earth to blood. Hoofbeats vanish into the dark. Silence falls heavier than the storm. Years later, the same valley. Red dust rises from the trail. Three riders charge hard toward a lonely house, white smoke curling from its chimney. On the porch, a woman raises an old shotgun. The barrel holds steady. No tremble in her hands. They rein up short, but the second storm has already begun. Nevada Territory, 1882. The dresses were the first thing he saw. Blue calico, yellow calico, snapping on a line strung between two fence posts that shouldn't have been standing. Not after 10 years. Not after everything he'd told himself about this place, on the long ride out from the railhead. The same tired speech he'd giving himself for 3 days straight. It's just dirt now. Just a signature and a walk away. Emmett Calloway pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the ridge and just looked, because that's what you do. When the thing in front of you refuses to make sense, you look. You wait for it to correct itself. You wait for the wind to be lying to you. It wasn't lying. 10 years is a long time to carry a picture of a place in your head and never once let it change. In Emmett's memory, this valley was gray, sun-bleached. A house with a sagging porch and windows, gone dark as a dead man's eyes because that's what it had been the morning he rode out of it at 23, saddlebags packed. A reputation already starting to grow behind him like a shadow. He hadn't yet learned to outrun. The house below him now had smoke curling out of its chimney. Clean glass in the windows catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back at him like a wink. A garden fence, mended. Straight as a soldier's spine. Somewhere down there, a rooster was announcing something to nobody in particular. Even the porch steps, which he remembered creaking and warped, had been reset level. The wood pail where new boards had replaced old. The kind of small correction that costs a person real hours of real labor for no reward. Beyond a house that doesn't complain underfoot. Someone was living in a dead man's home. Emmett's jaw tightened. His horse shifted beneath him, feeling it too, that old tension riders learn to read off a man's spine before he even knows it himself, the particular stillness of an animal that trusts its rider's instincts more than its own eyes. He nudged the animal forward, slow, the way you approach something that might still have teeth. He remembered, unbidden, riding the same stretch of trail as a boy, no older than 9 or 10, his father ahead of him on a big roan gelding, pointing out landmarks with the particular economy of a man who believed a thing worth teaching was worth teaching once and expecting it remembered. That rock there marks the property line. That stand of junipers where you'll find shade if you're ever caught out here past noon. Learn the land, boy. It'll outlast every promise a man ever makes you, including mine. He hadn't thought of that lesson in years. It came back to him now, whole and unbidden, the particular gravel of his father's voice. And he found it harder than he expected to hear it again, after so long believing he'd left every last trace of the man behind. He told himself this was simple. He'd ride down. He'd find whoever had squatted on Calloway land. He'd run them off with a hard word, same as he'd have done with any drifter in the years before he stopped doing that kind of work for a living. Back when a hard word from Emmett Calloway usually didn't need to be followed up with anything else. Simple, he told himself. Again, the way a man repeats a lie. Enough time hoping repetition alone might finally make it true. Except it wasn't a drifter's camp down there. It was a home. Somebody had made it a home, and homes don't happen by accident. Homes take weeks of small, patient decisions nobody notices making. A swept porch, A garden turned and planted on schedule. A rooster kept fed because a rooster earns its keep telling you the hour. And that complicated everything, because Emmett had ridden 3 days through heat and dust and the particular loneliness of a man returning somewhere he'd sworn never to return. Also that he could stand in a land office for 10 minutes, sign his name, and be done with this whole chapter of his life for good. A home meant a person. A person meant a conversation. A conversation meant this wasn't going to be the clean, quiet errand he'd promised himself. Below the ridge, the valley opened out the way it always had in his memory, a long, shallow bowl of sagebrush and cracked earth ringed by mountains, still streaked with the last of the winter's snow, high and distant and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. The light out here had a particular quality he'd never quite found anywhere else in 10 years of looking, hard and clean and merciless at midday, but gentling fast toward evening into something that made even the most stubborn, unforgiving ground look, for an hour or two, like it might forgive a man something in return. He rode down anyway, because there wasn't another direction to ride. The trail into the yard passed the old windmill, still turning, though one of its blades had gone silver gray with weather in a way that told him nobody had climbed up to oil it in longer than he wanted to think about. Past the barn, roof patched in 3 different colors of wood, the newest boards pale as bone against the old. Past a small garden plot laid out in careful rows, beans climbing stakes lashed together with cord, the kind of order his own mother had once kept and his father had never once managed on his own. He dismounted at the foot of the porch steps. Boots hit dry ground. Dust rose in a lazy curl around his ankles, like the land itself was announcing him, the way it always had, the way it probably announced every rider who'd ever come up that trail, with something on his mind he hadn't fully decided how to say yet. The door opened before he reached the first step. A woman stood in the frame, straight-backed, black hair pulled back tight, not a strand loose, like even her hair had been taught discipline. She held a hoe across her body the way a soldier holds a rifle at parade rest, not raised, not threatening, just present, just ready, in the particular way of someone who has learned that readiness is cheaper than regret. Chinese, younger than he expected, older than she looked, somehow, in the eyes. She did not flinch. Emmett had spent years reading rooms for the moment before violence. He knew what fear looked like, on a face, the particular way it made a jaw tighten and a gaze drop half an inch, hunting for the nearest exit without meaning to. He knew what bluster looked like, too, all noise and no weight behind it, men puffing themselves up because they didn't trust what's actually inside them to be enough. This was neither. This was a woman who had already decided, long before he ever crested that ridge, that she was not leaving. Not for a stranger. Not for anyone. "This is Calloway land," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it. 10 years of silence does that to a throat. It forgets how to be gentle with itself. "I am aware," she said. Flat, certain, her English clean, precise, carrying the faint music of somewhere far from this valley, somewhere with rivers and rain, and a language that shaped its vowels full differently than the dust ever had. "I'm Emmett Calloway." He said it like it was supposed to mean something. Like his name still had weight out here. Because it used to. Because men used to go quiet when they heard it, used to take one step back without quite meaning to. She didn't step back. She didn't even blink. "The land has been sleeping," she said, her eyes moving past him to the valley behind, to the green scar of cottonwoods he hadn't yet learned to read the meaning of. "I have been waking it." Emmett stood there, hat in hand, though he didn't remember taking it off. Pontost, trying to find the thread of the conversation he thought he was going to have, and finding it had already slipped out of his fingers, replaced by something stranger and harder to hold. "I'm selling," he said, forcing it back onto ground he understood. Ground with edges. Ground that made sense. "You'll need to be gone. I see." Not agreement, not argument, just noted, like weather, like a fact she was filing away to deal with later. The way you'd note that clouds were building in the west and decide, calmly, when you'd bring the wash in. There was nothing performed about it. Emmett noticed, nothing meant to impress or unsettle him. Just the plain, unhurried economy of a person who had long ago stopped wasting energy on reaction. That changed nothing. End of the week, he said. She tilted her head. Something moved behind her eyes. Not panic. Calculation, quick and cool. The kind that comes from a person who has had to do a great deal of that particular kind of thinking in her life and has gotten efficient at it. A week, she repeated. I will need it. You understand, he said, before she could answer, needing to hear himself say the practical part out loud, if only to remind himself he still had a plan at all. This is Callaway land. Has been 40 years. I mean to sell it, and whoever buys it won't likely take kindly to finding somebody already settled in. I understand a great many things, Suyin said. That is one of them. And you're not leaving today. I did not say that either. You said a week. I said I would need a week, she corrected, precise as a woman counting stitches. There is a difference between needing time and refusing to go. I have not yet decided which one this is. He should have said no. He'd survived on saying no for years in places considerably less forgiving than this porch. No was cheap and fast, and it kept a man moving, kept him from getting tangled in other people's lives, the way tangling always seemed to end badly for somebody. But he looked at her standing in the doorway of a house that was his and wasn't, that felt more lived in after 3 short days of her than it had, after 20 years of his own family passing through its rooms. And the no didn't come. It just didn't. He waited for it, and it simply wasn't there. 1 week, he said instead. Tight. Like the words cost him something he hadn't budgeted for. May I ask your name? He added before he'd quite decided to. Suyin, she said. Suyin Quan. Quan, he repeated. Something in the way she said it, careful, a little guarded, told him there was a story folded up behind the name, and that she wasn't ready to hand it to a stranger on a porch. He didn't push. He turned, walked back to his horse, felt her eyes on his back the whole way, and that was its own kind of unfamiliar, being watched by someone who wasn't afraid of him. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He wasn't sure he liked it. He wasn't sure he didn't. He was almost mounted, came up when one question came up out of him before he could stop it. Thought the way questions sometimes do when a man's mind has been circling something too long to keep it politely contained. Who told you that you could stay here? Her posture shifted, just slightly. Just enough that a man who'd spent a decade reading exactly that kind of shift for a living would catch it. Mr. Pruitt, she said. Emmett's hand froze on the saddle horn. Pruitt. Silas Pruitt. His father's foreman. The man who'd taught him to read a sky before a storm broke it open, who'd taught him to sit a horse like he was born to it, instead of merely riding one, who'd taught him more about being a man than his own father ever had the patience or the words for. Pruitt, who used to sit him down after supper and talk in that slow, deliberate way of his, about what a man owed the people around him, back before Emmett had gone, and forgotten most of those lessons somewhere between here and 2 territories over. Silas Pruitt, who, according to the one letter Emmett had gotten out of this valley in 10 years, a letter 3 years old and creased soft from too much folding, had died of fever 6 years ago. That's not possible, Emmett said. The woman's face didn't change. I only tell you what I was told. He stood there in the yard with the wind pulling at his coat and a dead man's name hanging in the air between them, and for the first time since he'd crossed back into this territory, Emmett Callaway understood, somewhere low in his gut, where the truest understandings always seem to arrive, first, that he had ridden into something much bigger than a piece of paper and a signature, because a dead man doesn't hand out permission, which meant somebody wasn't dead. Before he rode for town, some old habit, or maybe just plain stubbornness, made him ask one more thing. Mind if I look inside? Just the front room. It's still my father's house, whatever else it's become. Something flickered across Su Yin's face, and for the first time she seemed to weigh a decision, rather than simply announce one. Then she stepped aside from the door. The front room was smaller than he remembered, the way rooms from childhood always seemed to shrink once a man's grown into his full height. The hearth was the same stone hearth his father had built with his own hands the summer. Emmett turned 9, though it had been swept clean and mended in one corner where the mortar had crumbled. A quilt hung, folded over the back of a chair that hadn't been there before. Patterns of blue and gold he didn't recognize. Careful work, hours of somebody's evenings sewn into it. He ran a thumb along one seam without quite meaning to, the stitches so even they might have been laid by machine, though he doubted this house had ever known one. He walked toward the small room off the kitchen without quite meaning to, the room that had been his mother's, where she used to sit by the window with her sewing basket until the light failed. The door was ajar. Inside, a narrow bed neatly made, a washstand, and on the small table beneath the window, in place of his mother's old sewing basket, a modest chest and a framed likeness, faded, of a young man Emmett didn't recognize, dark-eyed, smiling, the particular unguarded smile of someone captured in a photograph before life had taught him to be careful with his face. "My husband," Su Yin said quietly, from the doorway behind him. "I did not think you would come this far into the house." "I didn't either," Emmett admitted. He looked at the room a moment longer. His mother had died when he was 19, quiet and quick, a fever that took her in 11 days, and his father had never once, in all the years after, spoken her name above a whisper. Emmett had assumed riding in that this room would still smell of her, that some ghost, Wäschercher, of lavender and thread would still be caught in the walls. Instead, it smelled of someone else's grief, tended just as carefully as his mother had, once tended her own small kingdom of needle and cloth. It should have felt like a violation. It didn't. It felt unaccountably like the room had simply been waiting for somebody to need it again, the way certain rooms seem to hold their breath between one grief and the next, patient, uncomplaining, ready to be filled however life next saw fit to fill them. "She'd have liked that you kept it neat," Emmett said, surprising himself. "My mother. She wasn't much for company, but she couldn't abide a room left careless." "Then we would have understood one another," Soin said. "I did not know her, but I think we would have." On his way back through the front room, something on the mantel caught the light and held it. His father's old pocket watch, the case dented on one corner from a fall off a fence rail some 20 years back, sitting propped against the stone, where anyone passing would see it, polished, wound, the second hand still moving. "You kept this running," Emmett said, picking it up, the weight of it familiar in his palm in a way that surprised him, muscle memory older than most of what he could put into words. "It seemed a shame to let it stop," Suyin said. "A house needs a clock, and it was already a fine one." Emmett turned it over. On the back, worn nearly smooth by 30 years of his father's thumb, finding the same spot without ever meaning to, were two initials, scratched crude and simple, J.C. He'd forgotten the watch existed. He'd forgotten, if he was honest with himself, most of the small true things about his father, burying them somewhere beneath the larger, simpler grief of a boy who'd left before he ever had the chance to know the man as anything other than stern, and distant, and hard to please. "Keep it wound," Emmett said, setting it back on the mantel, careful, like it might bruise. "Please." "I intend to," Suyin said. "It was ticking when I found this house. I did not think it was mine to silence." Emmett nodded once, said nothing further, and walked back out into the afternoon light. Before mounting up, he found himself drawn a short way past the barn, toward a stand of cottonwood he hadn't consciously meant to visit, and stopped there a long moment, hat in hand again, without quite noticing when he'd taken it off. This was where his father had taught him to shoot. Years back, an old tin can balanced on a fence post and more patience than a boy of 10 had any right to expect from a man who read spoke twice when once would do. This was where he'd learned to sit a horse without holding the reins too tight, learned to read weather, in the particular way the cottonwood leaves turned pale, side up before a wind, learned in 100 small unspoken lessons what it meant to belong to a piece of ground. He hadn't let himself think about any of it in 10 years. Standing there now, the leaves murmuring soft overhead, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost unwelcome, how much of himself he'd left, buried out here, alongside his father, and how much of the man he'd become in the years since had simply been running from the boy who used to stand in this exact spot, waiting to be told he'd done something right. He carried that small, strange tenderness with him the whole ride into town, next to the confusion and the growing certainty that this valley was not done surprising him. The ride into Ironwood was hot, dry, the kind of heat that gets into a man's thoughts and won't let them settle, that turns an hour on horseback into something closer to a fever dream, sunglut and dust, and one name looping over and over until it stopped sounding like a name at all. Pruitt, 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 Pruitt. Emmett turned it over so many times it started sounding like a question instead of a word, because a dead man can't hand out permission to live somewhere. Except she hadn't lied. He'd have known if she lied. 10 years of reading men, across a poker table, across a standoff, across the last 3 seconds before somebody's hand went for iron. That kind of reading doesn't turn off just because a man hangs up his gun and tells himself he's a different sort. Now, the last 3 seconds. He hadn't let himself think about those in a long while. And somehow, out here, alone on a dusty road, with nothing but his own thoughts for company, the memory came up anyway, uninvited, the way old memories do, when a man's guard has worn thin, from too many strange things happening too close together. 2 territories over, a town called Marrow Flats that didn't exist on any map worth trusting. A man named Cade Bishop, who'd made it his particular pleasure to humiliate anyone smaller than him, and who'd cornered a 15-year-old stable boy in an alley one evening over some invented debt, meaning to make an example that would keep the boy's family compliant for years. Emmett hadn't known the boy's name, hadn't known Bishop from any other bully who wore a gun like a promise. He'd only known, watching from across the street, that the particular for fear on that boy's face was recognized from somewhere far too close to home, and that he was done watching people who couldn't protect themselves get ground down by people who could. He'd called Bishop out, not for glory, not for reputation, though reputation was exactly what it had earned him, spreading fast and ugly through 2 territories the way these things always do. Hobble twisted a little more with every retelling, until the man in the story bore only a passing resemblance to Emmett himself. He'd only meant to give the boy a chance to run. Bishop hadn't given him much choice after that. It had ended the way those things end. Quick, ugly, necessary. Emmett had told himself for years afterward, though necessary was a word that had never once made sleeping any easier. He still, on the worst nights, could recall the particular silence of that alley afterward, the way sound seemed to drain out of the whole world for a handful of seconds before the shouting started, before men came running to see what had happened and found, instead of the bully they expected, still standing, a stranger they didn't recognize, and a stable boy who wouldn't stop and shaking long enough to explain what he'd witnessed. He'd left Marrow Flats within the week, before the dead man's friends could organize themselves into something more dangerous than grief. And he'd kept moving for the better part of a decade after, one territory bleeding into another, never quite settling long enough for a new reputation to catch up with the old one. He didn't like where that thought was headed either, so he tried to outrun it, same as the other. Rode faster until the wind stripped the thinking clean out of his head, for a few good minutes and left only the simple animal work of staying in the saddle. The town came up out of the heat shimmer like a mirage that had decided against all sense to be permanent. One dusty street, a rail depot, with its water tower standing sentinel over everything. A scatter of clapboard buildings baking under a white sky, their paint gone the color of old bone. Two riders blocked the road before he'd gone 20 feet past the first building. Big men, broad through the shoulders, pistols tied low on their thighs. The mark of men who expected to use them and didn't much care who knew it. The one nearest him was older than his partner by a good 10 years. Gray, coming in, thick at his temples, a thin, pale scar running along the underside of his jaw, like something had once tried very hard to open his throat and only half succeeded. "That's a fine horse," the taller one said, eyes crawling over the animal, like he was pricing it for auction. "You new to these parts?" "Passing through," Emmett said. Hands still, visible, resting easy on the horn of the saddle where they could be seen doing nothing at all. "This valley belongs to Mr. Drummond," the older, gray-templed one said. Slow, deliberate, like he was reciting something he'd said 100 times before to 100 other strangers who'd all, presumably, learned to be a great deal more careful after hearing it. "You've got business here, buying or selling. He's the man you talk to. Saves everybody time. Not a suggestion. A warning wearing a friendly hat." "I'll keep that in mind," Emmett said. He nudged his horse forward. For one long breath, neither man moved. Then they parted, slow, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that says we let you through because we chose to, not because you made us. He didn't look back, but he felt their eyes on him the rest of the way down the street, and he found himself, without quite meaning to, memorizing the older one's face, the scar, the particular way he sat his horse, weight settled heavy on the left stir or up, like an old injury, had taught him to favor that side. A man doesn't forget a face like that, not when his gut is already telling him he'll be seeing it again. The land office smelled like dry paper and old sweat. A clerk in a green eye shade, hunched over a bureau ledger, like it might run off if he looked away from it for even a moment. And in the only chair in the room, sitting like he owned the whole square footage of Ironwood, maybe the whole territory, was a man in a clean dark suit, silvering hair, a mustache trimmed with more care than most men gave their whole face. He looked like a man who had never once in his life been rained on without an umbrella already in hand. He stood when Emmett walked in, smiled like a man greeting a meal. "Well, well." He extended a hand Emmett didn't take. A new face. "Don't get many of those out here. Josiah Drummond." "I'm here to file a notice of sale," Emmett said. "The Callaway homestead." The clerk's head up fast. Quick enough head came up fast. Quick enough Alma filed away next to the older rider's scar. And the way this whole town seemed to hold its breath a little differently whenever Drummond's name got said out loud. Drummond's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. The Callaway place. He said it slow, testing the shape of it in his mouth, like a man tasting wine he already knew the vintage of. "Heard the old man passed years back. Heard the son ran off. Figured him dead in a ditch somewhere, if I'm honest. Way these things usually go for who leave a place like this and don't come back." "The son's back," Emmett said. Drummond's eyes went over him, unhurried, cataloging the dust on his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the particular way he stood, weight balanced even, hands loose, like a man who'd once been paid a great deal of money to stand exactly that way in exactly that kind of room. Calculating. Is that so? He spread his hands, warm, generous. A man about to do somebody a favor whether they wanted one or not. "I might take it off your hands. Poor land, of course. Water's unreliable out that way. Always has been. Everybody in this valley will tell you the same. But for the sake of neighborliness, seeing as you've come such a long way, $200. He said the figure the way a man might toss a coin to a beggar, expecting gratitude rather than negotiation. An insult dressed up as charity, and dressed carefully, the way a man dresses something he's done many times before and gotten good at doing. 1,000, Emmett said. Picked the number out of thin air and threw it down like a card he hadn't been sure he had, until the moment it left his hand. Drummond laughed. Short, barking. The clerk, Emmett noticed, did not laugh, did not even look up from his ledger, the particular stillness of a man who has learned that laughing along or not, laughing along both carry risks he'd rather not run. 1,000 for a shack and a ghost story. He leaned in, voice dropping to something meant to sound friendly and land like a threat instead. I hear you've got yourself a little complication out there. A Chinese woman, squatting. That lowers the value some. Wouldn't you agree? Tell you what, sign it to me for 300, and I'll handle the complication. Clean. Something cold lit up in Emmett's chest. He'd ridden into this valley to bury his past, not to find a new fight waiting for him with its arms crossed and a smile on its face. But the way Drummond said complication, like Suyin, was a stain on a ledger, instead of a person standing on a porch with a hoe held like a rifle, refusing to be afraid of a stranger twice her size, struck something in Emmett that 10 years hadn't managed to grind all the way down. The land's not for sale, he said. Not to you. He turned and walked out, leaving a silence behind him, thick enough to choke on. The clerk's pen finally scratching again somewhere behind him, resuming a rhythm that had briefly, unmistakably, stopped. He was no longer a seller. He didn't know yet what he was instead. But he knew Drummond's men would be watching the road out of town, and he knew this wasn't finished. Not by a long way. He crossed the street toward the general store, thinking he might buy provisions before, but the ride back, Ficklet, a college-powered back, and the shopkeeper, a stooped man with floured forearms watched with an expression, foot epinate, had symbol for. In other towns, on other faces, not unfriendly, careful. The particular caution of a man doing arithmetic about who might be watching this exchange, and what it might cost him later. You're the Calloway boy, the shopkeeper said low, like the words themselves might get him in trouble just for being spoken. I am. Word travels fast in this town. He set 2 tins of coffee on the counter, without being asked, the kind of small kindness offered, instead of the larger one a man doesn't quite dare give, his eyes flicking once toward the window and back, the particular nervous habit of a man who has spent years learning exactly which conversations were safe to be seen having. You ought to be careful who you cross out here, son. This valley's got a way of forgetting men who cross the wrong person. I've noticed, Emmett said. The shopkeeper glanced toward the window, toward the land office visible down the street, and said nothing else. Didn't need to. Emmett paid for the coffee and left, and he carried that particular silence with him the rest of the afternoon, turning it over next to everything else this valley had already handed him in a single day. He almost didn't stop at the saloon, almost. But his throat was dust, and his head was full of Pruitt's name going nowhere useful. So he stepped into the dim, warm dark of the place and ordered whiskey he had no intention of finishing. An old man 3 stools down was already 3 drinks past sober, watery eyes. A voice that carried too far for a room that quiet. Calloway, the old man said, squinting at him. You're a Calloway. Got the same walk as your daddy. Same stubborn set to the shoulders. Emmett went still. You knew him. Everybody knew Jonas Calloway. The old man took another pull from his glass. Stubborn old cuss. Wouldn't sell his water rights to Drummond, no matter how many times. Drummond asked, nice, then asked not so nice. He squinted, remembering. Fair man, though, your daddy. Never once shorted a hired hand a day's pay even in the lean years. Gave old widow, Foster, grain on credit 3 winters running, and never once called it in when the crops failed her too. Man had his rough edges. Wasn't cruel with them, is what I mean to say. Plenty of men out here are both. He was only the one. I don't remember him that way, Emmett said, quiet, almost to himself. Remember him hard to please. Remember leaving, because I couldn't stand another year of not measuring up to whatever he wanted from me. Fathers and sons, the old man said, with the particular weary wisdom of a man who'd buried a few disappointments of his own. Half of what looks like a man being hard to please is just a man who never learned the words for being proud. I expect your daddy was prouder of you than either of you ever managed to say out loud. Grief does that to folks too. Makes them realize what they never said. He died of a fever, Emmett said. Flat. Like saying it out loud would make it true again. The way repeating a prayer sometimes seems to make the words solid, dependable, load-bearing. The old man laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. Fever. He shook his head slow. Ain't what I heard. What I heard is there was a storm that spring. Bad one. Lightning split old man Cotter's barn clean in half. You can still see the scorch mark on what's left standing. And somewhere in the middle of all that thunder, your daddy went out, docked to check his stock and never came back in. Emmett's hand tightened around the glass. They found him, he said. It wasn't a question, it was a demand for the story to be the one he already knew. The one he'd carried quiet and settled for 10 years, without ever once picking it up to look closely at the edges. Did they? The old man's eyes were suddenly clearer than they had any right to be, given the 3 empty glasses lined up in front of him. Nobody I ever talked to saw a body, son. Just heard he was gone. Same week he told Drummond no for the last time. Storm cleared out by morning like it had never happened at all. Sky washed blue and empty, and your daddy simply wasn't anywhere in it anymore. The saloon kept making its noise around them. Glasses. A low hum of talk at the far tables. Somebody's boot heels on the plank floor unhurried, unaware. None of it reached Emmett, because the ground he'd been standing on, the simple, settled fact of a father, dead of natural causes, buried, mourned, done, had just tilted underneath him. And he was still trying to find his footing when the old man pushed back from the bar and shuffled out into the white afternoon light, like he hadn't just cracked a decade open with 6 sentences. Emmett sat there a long moment. Storm refused to sell, never came back. He thought of Pruitt, a dead man handing out permission to live in a dead man's house. He thought of Drummond's smile, warm as a knife left out too long in the sun. And underneath all of it, quiet and cold, a thought he didn't want and couldn't put down. What if none of this was an accident? Any of it. He paid for the whiskey he hadn't drunk and walked out into a heat that felt, somehow, different than it had going in. Sharper. Like the whole valley had been waiting a decade for someone to finally start asking the right questions, and had just decided, quietly, to help him along. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the ride out. Going, he'd been a man with an errand. A simple small errand, the kind that ends in a signature and a train ticket. Coming back, he was a man with questions he didn't know how to ask, and no one left alive. Or so he'd believed that very morning, who could answer them honestly. Except maybe one. Except maybe a dead man who apparently wasn't. The sun was low when he came over the last rise, painting the valley, the color of a bruise healing, orange, purple, that soft gold light that makes even hard land look forgiving for a few minutes a day, like it was apologizing in advance for whatever the night might still hold. Suyin was in the yard, not packing, not a single crate in sight. She was driving a fence post into the ground for the goat pen, swinging a mallet with a kind of economy that told him this wasn't the first fence she'd ever built, and likely wouldn't be the last. The rails were lashed on, with knots Emmett hadn't seen since he was a boy on a freighter out of San Francisco. Before this desert ever had a claim on him, before he'd learned that a man could be pulled in 2 directions at once and survive it, mostly if he was stubborn enough about which direction he chose in the end. Where'd you learn to tie a bowline like that? He asked. Quiet, not accusing, just curious in a way that surprised him. She didn't look up from the post. "My father fished a river you have never seen," she said. Simple, direct. And it opened up 100 questions. He didn't know how to line up in the right order. Questions about rivers and fathers and the particular grief of leaving a place behind and finding, years later, that some piece of it had followed you anyway, stitched into your hands. "He teach you the mallet too?" Emmett asked, nodding at the post. "Or is that new?" "Everything is new when you begin with nothing," she said. "Not bitter. Just true, the way a fact is true, the way weather is true." Somewhere behind the barn, the rooster crowed again, off schedule, indignant about something only. It understood. "That bird," Emmett said, "has opinions about the hour that don't match the sun." "His name is General," Suyin had said, entirely serious. "He believes himself to be in command of the yard. I have not yet found the heart to correct him. Despite everything, despite the ache in his ribs that hadn't even happened yet, and the 10 years of dust behind him, and the dead man's name still turning circles in his skull, Emmett found himself, briefly, laughing. It surprised him more than almost anything else that had happened since he'd crested that ridge. "Here," he said, nodding at the half-finished rail. "Let me set the last of these. You've been at it since before I left this morning, unless I miss my guess. You do not need to. Didn't say I needed to. Said I would." He picked up a rail, fitted against the post, and held it steady while she lashed it fast, the two of them falling almost without noticing, into an easy rhythm. Hold and tie, the kind of small cooperative labor that asks nothing of conversation and offers something anyway. For a few minutes, with the evening settling gold and quiet around them, it was almost possible to forget the whole valley was conspiring against them. He was still trying to find a response worth the weight of her earlier words when the sound reached them. Hoofbeats, fast. Two riders coming hard across the flat, and Emmett knew, before he could see their faces, that this wasn't a friendly errand. "Last chance, old man," the taller one shouted, spurring toward the goat pen, aiming to scatter the animals, to break whatever fragile order Suyen had built here, with her bare hands and a bowline knot. "Get off this land. Take your stray with you." The word landed uglier than the man likely meant it, or perhaps exactly as ugly as he meant it, and something in Emmett went cold and sure in a way it hadn't since he'd crossed back into this territory. Emmett moved before his mind caught up to his body. No gun. He'd sold his rig years ago, a promise, made to himself in a moment he could no longer fully remember the shape of in a room a short 2 territories over that he still didn't let himself think about in daylight. So he grabbed the only thing within reach, Suyen's mallet, heavy, awkward, 10 years out of practice in his hands, and ran to put himself between the horse and the pen. He swung too early. The rider dodged, laughed. The second man was already off his horse, coming at Emmett on foot, and Emmett's stomach dropped with a strange, cold recognition. The gray temples, the thin, pale scar along the jaw. The same man who'd blocked the road into town that morning. Weight settled heavy on his left leg like an old injury. Moving toward him now, with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who'd done this kind of work more times than he'd bothered to count. This was not the fight of a man who used to be fast and dangerous. This was the fight of a man who'd let 10 years of rust settle into muscles that used to know exactly what to do without being asked twice. Emmett got the mallet up in time to block the first blow. The shock of it, the clean up both arms, and for one wild second, the two of them strained against each other, weight against weight, boots skidding in the loose dirt, before the older man wrenched the mallet free and sent it spinning off into the dirt. Emmett's hands came up bare after that, old habit finally waking up in his knuckles, and he landed one good punch. Split a lip. Felt good for exactly 1 second. Then the older man's weight drove him back into the fence, hard, and the air left his lungs in one long punch of pain, and the world tipped sideways, and somewhere above him a horse was circling, closing in, and Emmett thought, with a strange, distant calm that felt almost embarrassed given the circumstances, this is it. This is how it ends. In a yard I didn't even want, for a woman I barely know. 10 years of staying alive in rooms considerably more dangerous than this one, and it's a goat pen that finally does it, sit. A sharp metallic click cut through everything. Both men froze. Emmett looked up. Suyin stood on the porch, an old fowling piece braced against her hip, held steady as stone, the barrel aimed at the dust, just ahead of the circling horse's front hooves. The next one, she said, and her voice carried across that yard, with a clarity that made the hair rise on Emmett's arms, will be higher. The rider's bravado drained out of his face, like water, through cracked ground. Whatever he'd expected riding out here, a frightened woman, an easy scattering of goats and resolve alike, this plainly wasn't it, and the recalculation showed plain on his features, the particular startled respect of a man forced to revise, in the space of a single breath, everything he'd assumed about who he was dealing with. He looked at his partner, bleeding into the dirt. He looked back at the small, still woman with the very large gun. He spat. This ain't over. But there wasn't a shred of conviction left in it. They rode off in a boil of angry dust, and the silence they left behind was the loudest thing Emmett had heard all day. He pushed himself up off the fence, ribs aching, split knuckles, the whole left side of his face already starting to throb in time with his pulse. Suyin lowered the shotgun. Her arms trembled. Not from fear, he realized. From the sheer weight of the old gun, held steady far longer than her frame was built to hold it. The trembling of muscle finally allowed to admit how hard it had been working. "Where'd you get that?" he managed. "It was in the house," she said, "with Mr. Pruitt's things." That name again. That ghost walking through every corner of this story, like he refused to stay buried, the way certain names simply refuse, once spoken, to lie back down. "You weren't afraid," Emmett said, watching her hands finally steady, now that the gun had been set aside. "Out here, with two armed men and only that old fowling piece between them and everything you'd built." "I was afraid," Suyin said. "I have simply learned that fear does not need to be the thing that decides what happens next. It is allowed to come along. It is not allowed to hold the reins." "That a lesson from your mother, too?" "That one," she said, "I learned on my own. The night the railroad company handed me $20 and my husband's hat and told me to be grateful. I was not asked to leave the territory outright." Something flickered across her face. Brief, controlled. "I was very afraid that night. I have not stopped being afraid some days. I have only stopped letting it choose for me." Emmett looked at her, really looked, past the calico dress, and the straight back, and the careful, guarded English, and something shifted behind his own eyes. He'd ridden in here to sell a worthless piece of land and walk away clean. Except the land wasn't worthless. He was starting to understand that now, in pieces, the way a man understands. A bruise is deeper than it looked once the swelling finally comes up. And it wasn't just the land that had changed his math. "They'll be back," Swin said, watching the dust the riders had left hanging in the air, gold and slow in the last of the light. "Mr. Drummond does not want this land." She pointed toward the far end of the property, toward a thin green line of cottonwoods Emmett had forgotten entirely, a scar of green cutting through all that dead gold scrub like a vein still carrying blood in a body everyone had assumed long cold. "He wants the water." Emmett followed her hand, stared at that green line like it was speaking to him, in a language he was only now starting to remember how to read, a language his father must have spoken fluently his whole life without Emmett ever once bothering to learn it. Cottonwoods didn't grow along a creek that ran dry every summer. Cottonwoods needed water year-round, which meant the creek he'd always assumed was seasonal, worthless, just like everything else his father had scraped a living from out here. That creek might be spring-fed, which meant this wasn't 80 acres of dust. This was the most valuable stretch of ground in the whole valley, and he had walked into Drummond's office that same afternoon and nearly given it away for $1,000 and a train ticket east. They spent the last of the daylight making the yard as defensible as two tired, aching people could manage on short notice. Emmett dragged the wagon across the gap in the fence where the riders had broken through. A poor barricade, but better than an open gate. Soon moved the goats into the barn proper, away from the pen's exposed rail, murmuring to them low and steady in a language Emmett didn't know, though the animals seemed to settle for it all the same. They won't try again tonight, Emmett said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. Not with two men already carrying bruises for their trouble. Perhaps, Suyin said, or perhaps a man like Drummond does not measure his patience by his men's bruises, only by how quickly he gets what he wants. She tested the wagon's placement against the broken fence gap once more, satisfied herself it would hold, and stood a moment surveying the darkening yard with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything. I have found, in my experience, that men who believe themselves entitled to a thing rarely give up simply because the first attempt cost them something. She wasn't wrong. He was coming to expect that of her by now, the particular discomfort of being told an unwelcome truth by someone who never seemed to enjoy telling it, only to have finished with the telling and move on to whatever needed doing next. That night the house was quiet in a way that felt earned instead of empty. A single kerosene lamp threw long shadows across the small kitchen, while Suyin moved through the space, an economy that reminded him, again, of the knots on that fence rail, nothing wasted, nothing careless. She set a simple meal in front of him. Rice, dried vegetables, seasoned with something he didn't recognize and didn't ask about. Not yet. He sat at the table cleaning the old shotgun, working oil into a stock that had clearly been cared for by someone who understood what it meant to keep a thing ready, even a thing you hoped you'd never have to use. You said Pruitt let you stay, Emmett said finally, into the quiet. Last I heard, he'd been dead 6 years. Suyin set a bowl of tea in front of him, steam curling up between them, like a small, fragile truce neither of them had quite agreed to yet. She sat, folded her hands. My husband worked the railroad, she began, her voice soft, though it didn't waver, the particular steadiness of a story that has been told, silently to oneself, many times before it is ever spoken aloud to another person. He helped raise the trestle over the canyon. There was an accident. A cable broke. She paused, and something behind her eyes went very still, very far away. The look of a person visiting a room they've furnished with grief and learned to walk through without stumbling. The company called it an act of God. They gave me $20 and told me to be grateful. Emmett said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound small next to that. $20 and an act of God weighed against a whole life. I had nowhere to go, she continued. I came to Ironwood. I was lost, is the word, I think, in your language. An old man found me sleeping near the depot. Ragged clothes, kind eyes, the kind that had clearly seen too much and decided against all sense to stay kind anyway. He bought me a meal. He listened. She paused. And in that pause, Emmett felt the shape of the story arriving before the words did. The way you can feel a storm coming from the pressure, alone, long before the first cloud shows itself over the ridge. I remember the depot smelled of coal smoke and cut pine, she said, and I remember thinking I had never in my life felt so entirely without a place in the world. I had money enough for perhaps 4 more meals. I did not know this territory, did not know its roads or its dangers, had only the clothes I carried and a grief I did not yet know how to set down even for an hour. She turned the teacup slow between her hands, not drinking from it, just holding the warmth. The old man sat beside me on that bench a long while before he ever spoke. I thought at first he meant me harm, the way I had learned by then to expect from strangers who noticed me too closely. But he only watched the trains a while, and then he said, very quiet, "You have the look of someone who has just buried something." I did not answer. I did not need to. He told me of a place, she continued, a good house, a well that never ran dry. He said the owner was a boy who had run off years before, probably dead in a ditch, he said. A faint, almost apologetic look crossed her face. He said the place needed a soul in it, or it would die too. Emmett set the oiled rag down. His hands had gone still. He gave me paper, Suyin said, so that if anyone asked, I would have something to show. She rose, crossed to a small wooden chest in the corner, came back with a folded, yellowed sheet, handling it the way a person handles something they've protected for years through weather and worry and the particular fragility of owning almost nothing else. Emmett unfolded it. The handwriting was faint, spidery, the hand of a man whose strength had been failed when he wrote it. But it was unmistakably Silas Pruitt's. Let the bearer, Mrs. Kwan, reside at the Calloway homestead. The place needs a soul in it. Forgive an old man's presumption. S. Pruitt. Not a deed, not legal. Just a kindness, scrawled out by a man everyone in this valley believed had been dead for 6 years. Emmett stared at the paper until the words blurred and rearranged themselves into a truth he didn't want and couldn't argue with. Pruitt hadn't died. He'd walked away. And on his way out, he'd given away a home that wasn't his to give to a woman who had nothing. In a valley full of people who'd have turned her out without a second thought if they'd known the truth of how she'd come to be there. Anger and something close to moved through Emmett at the same time, tangled together so tight he couldn't separate them. One feeling refusing to let go of the other long enough for him to sort out which was bigger. He wasn't wrong, Emmett said, voice rough, about the place needing a soul. He looked at Suyin, truly looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself look before, and saw her the way Pruitt must have seen her that day at the depot. Not a squatter, not a complication to be handled, cleaned up, priced at $300, and forgotten. The way Drummond had so casually suggested that same afternoon in a room that smelled like dry paper and old sweat. The soul this place had been waiting for. Your husband, Emmett said after a while. Careful with it. The way you're careful stepping onto ice you're not sure will hold. What was his name? Something moved across her face, quick, surprised, like nobody had asked her that particular question in a long while. Way, she said. He laughed easily. He was not a careful man, the way careful is usually meant. He trusted the world more than the world deserved. A small, sad smile. I think that is why I loved him. And I think that is why the world took him. My father wasn't careful either, Emmett said, before he'd quite decided to say it. Told a man like Drummond no, more than once, when saying yes would have been the easy thing. Suyin looked at him a long moment. Then perhaps, she said, it is not carelessness. Perhaps it is only that some men refuse to let fear choose for them. And the world does not always forgive that. But I do not think it is the men who are wrong. You sound like somebody who's had a long time to make peace with that particular unfairness. I have had long enough, Suyin said, quiet. Enough time to stop asking why the world is unfair and start asking, instead, what a person means to do about it. She said it without bitterness, the particular hard-won calm of someone who had already asked the harder question many times over and had simply grown tired of the asking. And you, Emmett asked, you could have taken the $20, kept your head down somewhere quiet. Instead, you built a corral and a garden and stood on that porch with a shotgun for a man's father you never met. I have already been careful once, Suyin said. It cost me the only thing I loved and left me $20 poorer for the trouble. I decided, coming here, that I would rather build something and lose it than never build at all. And if you lose this too, Emmett asked, quiet. This house, This land. Whatever comes of the week I gave you. Suyin considered the question a long moment, the lamplight catching the steadiness in her eyes. Then I will have lost it, having built something worth losing, she said. That is not nothing, Mr. Calloway. Some people go a whole lifetime and never risk building anything worth grieving over at all. Emmett didn't have an answer for that, either. He just sat with it, turning it over the way he'd been turning over everything else this valley had handed him in a single, impossible day. Later, long after the lamp had burned low and Suyin had gone to the small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to Emmett's mother, he sat alone at the table, with his father's shotgun broken open across his knee, and his mind refusing every offer of sleep. Storm refused to sell, never came back. Pruitt, alive, hiding, handing out mercy from the shadows, like a man who owed the world a debt he couldn't pay any other way. Drummond's men, twice, in one day, treating this ranch-like territory already conquered in every way but paper. And underneath all of it, a green line of cottonwoods that meant this 80 acres of dust was worth more than Drummond wanted anyone to know. Emmett had come back to this valley to cut the last thread, tying him to who he used to be. Sign a paper, take the money, disappear east, and never look back. Except he was sitting instead in his father's kitchen, ribs aching, a shotgun in his lap. Stranger's fate tangled up with his own by a note from a ghost who wouldn't stay buried. And somewhere out in the dark, men who worked for Josiah Drummond were already planning their next visit. He should leave. That was still, technically, the smart play. Take what he could, ride east. Let this valley keep its secrets, the way it had kept them for 6 long years already. Except he thought of Suyin standing on that porch, arms trembling under the weight of an old shotgun, refusing to let 2 grown men scatter her goats or her resolve. Except he thought of his father going out into a lightning storm and never coming back 1 week after telling Josiah Drummond no for the last time. Except he thought of Pruitt's spidery handwriting. The place needs a soul in it, and understood with a clarity that settled into his chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well, that he was done running from this valley. He'd spent 10 years believing a man was defined by the worst thing he'd ever done, by a dead man in an alley 2 territories over, by a name that made grown men step back without meaning to, by every door he'd walked through since that had gone quiet the moment somebody recognized his face. He thought of the stable boy in Marrow Flats, a face he could no longer clearly picture, a name he'd never learned. Wondered, not for last Palm's time, not for the first time, whether that boy had grown into a man who remembered the stranger who'd bought him those few extra seconds to run, or whether the whole encounter had simply dissolved into one more forgotten, frightening night in a childhood that likely held plenty of them. It didn't matter, Emmett supposed, sitting there in the low lamplight. He hadn't done it to be remembered. He'd done it because the alternative, watching and doing nothing, had been a good deal harder to live with than whatever came after. Sitting there in the low lamplight, listening to the wind pick up outside, gusting harder now than it had an hour before, rattling loose at the shutters, in a way that made the hair on his arms rise. For reasons that had nothing to do with fear, Emmett Calloway began to understand it might work the other way around. A man gets defined by what he chooses to stand and guard. And for the first time in 10 years, he had something worth standing for. Outside, far off, thunder rolled once against the mountains, low and unhurried, testing its own voice. The dresses on the line snapped hard now in a wind that smelled, unmistakably, like rain about to arrive in earnest. Clouds had swallowed the stars, somewhere, in the last hour, without his noticing exactly when. A storm was building out past the ridge, the same direction. He realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature that his father had walked into 6 years before and never walked back out of. Emmett sat very still, listening to it come. because that was the whole of it, wasn't it? Because a man could ride 10 years in any direction he pleased and still end up sitting in the same kitchen, listening to the same kind of storm, waiting to find out what it meant to take after his father, after all. Until he caught himself doing it again, turning the same three facts over and over like a coin that refused to land. Except this time the coin had a name attached to it, Pruitt, and a debt. And a woman down the hall who trusted the week wasn't over yet. He wasn't afraid of the storm so much as he was determined, for reasons he couldn't yet fully explain even to himself, not to let this valley take anything else from him without a fight. The storm broke a little after midnight. It came the way the old man, in the saloon, had described the one 6 years before, sudden and total. Lightning turning the whole yard white for half a second at a time, thunder rolling in so close behind it that there was no counting the distance anymore, no comfortable arithmetic of miles between flash and sound. The wind found every loose board on that house and worked at it like it had been waiting all along for permission. Emmett was on his feet before he'd fully decided to be. Old instinct, maybe. Or new fear, wearing an old instinct's clothes. The goats, Suyin said, already pulling a shawl around her shoulders, already moving toward the door, like the weather hadn't so much as slowed her down. I'll go. We will go. There wasn't time to argue the point, and some stubborn, still-forming part of him didn't want to anyway. They went out together into rain that came sideways, that found the collar of his coat within 10 steps, and turned it into a cold hand, pressed flat against his neck. The goat pen had come loose at one corner. A post Suyin had driven deep just that afternoon, now, leaning hard under the weight of a panicked animal, throwing itself against the rail. "Hold the lead," Emmett shouted, or tried to, the wind tearing half the words away before they reached her. She caught his meaning anyway, catching the rope. He threw, on the first try, despite the driving rain, and braced herself against the fence while he drove the post back upright with the flat of an axe head, lightning turning the whole operation into a series of frozen pictures, gone as soon as they arrived. Post. Rope. Suyin's face, calm even here, even now, rain streaming off her jaw like she'd made some private peace with weather itself a long time ago. The barn roof gave way somewhere in the middle of it, not all at once. Just a corner of shingle tearing loose with a sound like a gunshot, and for one terrible second Emmett thought the whole structure might follow it down. It didn't. But water started coming through fast, pooling dark, around the hooves of two frightened horses, and there was nothing for it but to wade in, calm the animals with a hand, flat and steady on each trembling neck, and haul a length of old canvas up over the worst of the gap while lightning kept turning the world, on and off around them, like a lamp somebody couldn't decide whether to leave lit. Emmett found himself talking low and constant to the horses the whole while. The same nonsense words his father used to murmur to spooked stock, words that meant nothing on their own and everything in the tone that carried them. And it struck him, even in the middle of the danger, how strange it was to hear his father's voice coming out of his own mouth after 10 years of trying not to sound anything like the man at all. It took the better part of an hour to get the barn and the pen both secure and the animals settled enough not to bolt. But by the time they made it calloused palms, by the time they made it back inside, they were both soaked through to the skin, and the fire had gone down to embers, and neither one of them moved right away to build it back up. They just stood there a moment, dripping onto the floorboards, catching their breath. "You didn't have to come out in that," Emmett said. "Neither did you. It's my land. It is my goats," Suyin said, and something in her voice, exhausted and a little raw at the edges, cracked just enough to let a small, surprised laugh through. Emmett found himself laughing too, low and disbelieving, the particular laughter that comes after fear has passed through a body and left something lighter behind in its place. The kind of laughter neither of them would have believed possible an hour earlier, soaked through and half frozen, in the ruins of a storm that had so nearly meant something far worse. He built the fire back up, while she wrung the worst of the water from her hair, and they sat close to it, not touching, not quite. The storm still working itself out overhead in long rolling complaints that seemed, gradually, to be moving off east. "My father died in a storm like this," Emmett said. He hadn't planned to say it. It simply arrived. The way certain true things do, once a person has been rained on hard enough to wash away whatever had been holding the words back. Suyin didn't offer him comfort he hadn't asked for. She just sat with it, the way she seemed to sit with most things, steady, unhurried, letting the weight of a statement finish landing before she added anything to it. Then perhaps, she said finally, tonight was not only a storm. Perhaps it was also proof that you are not him, that you can walk out into weather like that and walk back in again. Emmett looked at the fire a long time. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I just got lucky. One more time than he did." "Luck," Suyin said, "is rarely the whole of it. You went out into that yard for animals that are not yours, beside a woman you have known 3 days in weather that killed your own father. That is not luck. That is a choice. I have learned to tell the difference." He didn't have an answer for that. He just let the fire finish drying his coat, and somewhere in the low, comfortable silence that followed, exhaustion finally caught up with both of them, and the night, at last, let them rest. Morning came in slow and gray, the storm having spent itself some time before dawn, leaving the whole valley smelling of wet sage and turned earth. Emmett woke on the floor by the hearth, ribs announcing themselves before his eyes even opened, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. Then he smelled rice cooking, and he remembered. Suyin was already up, already dressed, already moving through the kitchen like the night's storm, and the evening before hadn't happened at all, except for the shotgun still leaning by the door where she'd set it down, within reach, without comment, and the faint shadows under her eyes that told him she'd slept about as much as he had, which was to say, not much at all. "You're hurt," she said. Not a question, a fact delivered the way she delivered most facts. Flat. Certain. "I'm fine, you are lying." He almost laughed. Almost. It hurt too much to fully commit to it. "Bruised," he corrected. "Not broken." She set a bowl in front of him anyway. Then, without asking, without making a production of it, she pressed 2 fingers along his ribs, testing, professional, like she'd done this 100 times before. On 100 other men who'd insisted they were fine when they very much were not. He flinched. "Broken," she said. Not smug about it, just correcting the record. "Where'd you learn that?" "My mother." A pause. "Before my father, before the river." She wrapped a strip of cloth around his side, tight, efficient. She kept people alive in a village that did not always want her to. Women who had no husband, left to speak for them, were not always welcome to practice medicine. She did it anyway. Quietly, and then not so quietly. Once enough people owed her their lives to matter more than their opinions about her. Emmett sat very still while she worked, because there was something about being tended to, carefully, competently, without pity, that undid something in him he hadn't expected to have undone. "Why?" he asked. "Why patch up a stranger who told you to be gone by the end of the week?" She tied off the bandage, looked at him for a long moment. "Because the week is not over," she said. That was all. And somehow it was enough to make the whole kitchen feel warmer than it had any right to, given the cold morning, and the cracked rib, and the men who'd tried to kill them both 12 hours earlier, and the storm that had come after, and the strange, quiet peace that had somehow followed all of it. "Let me do something for you in return," Emmett said, once the bandage was tied. "Fair's fair." Suyin raised an eyebrow, waiting. "That windmill out front hasn't been oiled since before I left. Squeaks like a dying thing every time the wind turns it. I noticed it riding in, and I've been hearing it in my sleep ever since. For the first time since he'd arrived, something close to a real smile crossed her face. "Then, by all means, Mr. Calloway, attend to your windmill." He spent the better part of an hour up on that rickety platform that afternoon, oil can in hand, ribs protesting every reach, and when he climbed back down the blades, turned silent as a held breath, and Suyin, watching from the garden, nodded once like a woman satisfied a debt had been properly settled. She'd swept the porch clean of the storms by then, righted the chair the wind had knocked over, and set about mending a torn seam in the quilt that had been shaken loose from its hook, her needle moving quick and sure. In the returning morning light, the whole ordinary rhythm of the house reasserting itself around them. Both, like it, had simply been waiting out the weather, same as they had. The riders came before noon the next day. 3 of them this time. Emmett heard them before he saw them. The particular, unhurried rhythm of men who knew they didn't need to rush, because the law itself was riding at their side. Josiah Drummond rode in the middle, dressed like he was attending church instead of a land seizure, not a CR. Not a spot of last night's rain anywhere on him, which told Emmett something about how a man like Drummond arranged his mornings. Beside him, a lean, sun-weathered man wearing a marshal's star, his face carrying the particular blankness of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that feelings only got in the way of the job. "Calloway," the marshal said, reining in at the foot of the porch. His voice was flat, official. "Reuben Hargrove, Territorial Marshal." Marshal. Emmett kept his hands loose at his sides, kept his eyes moving between the 3 of them. Hargrove held up a sheaf of papers. "I have a notice of seizure for this property." Drummond's smile arrived on cue, smooth as oil poured over water. "Seems," he said, savoring it, "you've been a little negligent. Territorial taxes on this land. Unpaid 10 years, with penalties and interest. The total comes to $1,250. The number landed like a fist, $1,250. Emmett had never held that much money in his whole life, not even close. And he understood, standing there in the cold morning light, that this wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't an accident, and it sure as hell wasn't about taxes. 48 hours, Hargrove continued, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he said it. A man reciting a rule he didn't necessarily agree with, but had sworn to enforce anyway. Cash, in full, or the properties seized by the territory, sold at public auction to the highest bidder. He glanced down at the papers, in his hand a moment, as though even he found the precision of the figure distasteful. $1,250, down to the exact cent. The kind of number that only ever comes from a ledger built to look honest rather than one that actually was. "And I," Drummond said, spreading his hands, like announcing good news, "will be that bidder. In fact, I expect I'll be the only one." He let that sit. Let it settle over the yard like the dust hadn't quite finished settling from the night before. "But I'm a reasonable man," he went on. "Sign the deed to me now. My original offer stands. $300. I'll settle the tax debt myself, and you walk away with something in your pocket instead of nothing at all." He glanced, finally, toward Suyin, standing quiet and unmoving on the porch, and something in his face shifted, dismissive, the particular carelessness of a man who has never once had to consider that the person he's looking at might be looking right back. "As for the woman," he added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm sure a girl handy with a hoe can find work somewhere. This valley's always short on hands willing to do the harder chores." "I am not a hand," Suyin said, quiet, level, the words landing with more weight than volume could have given them. "And I am not looking for work, Mr. Drummond. I have already found it. It is standing right here." Drummond blinked, some small flicker of surprise crossing his face at being addressed at all, let alone addressed like that, and Emmett felt something in his own chest loosen, just slightly, at the sight of it. Marshal Hargrove, Emmett noticed, had gone very still, watching that exchange with an attention that hadn't been there a moment before, his eyes moving from Suen to Drummond, and back again, like a man quietly revising an opinion he'd held too long without examining it. It was, Emmett had to admit, a perfect trap. Legal, airtight, dressed up in enough paperwork that no court in the territory would blink at it twice. He could take it, cut a los losses, ride east with $300, and the rest of his life ahead of him, unencumbered by ghosts, or water rights, or a woman on a porch who'd bandaged his ribs that same morning without being asked, who'd stood on this same porch with a shotgun the night before and hadn't so much as trembled from anything but the weight of the gun itself. He looked at Drummond's smug, triumphant face. Then he looked at Hargrove, impartial, unmoved, a man who dealt in paper, not people, though something in his stillness suggested that might not always remain quite so simple a matter. Then he looked at Suyin. She hadn't said another word since Drummond's comment. Didn't need to. Her face was calm, resolute. She wasn't pleading with him. She was simply watching, waiting to find out exactly what kind of man he'd turned out to be. Something old and stubborn stirred in Emmett's chest. The same something that had gotten him a reputation 2 territories over, once, that he'd spent 10 years trying to bury. "I'll have the money," he said. The words hung in the cold air. A declaration of war he had no earthly idea how he was going to win. Drummond's smile faltered. Just for a second, a flicker of real surprise breaking through the polish. Hargrove simply nodded, folding the papers back into his coat, though his eyes lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary on Suyin before he turned his horse. 48 hours, Calloway. They rode off, and Emmett stood in the yard, with the full weight of an impossible promise settling onto his shoulders. No plan, no money, and a clock that had already started running, whether he was ready or not. "You don't have $1,200, Suyin said. It wasn't an accusation, just an inventory of the facts they were now working with. No, you don't have a plan. Also no." She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before she pulled it back under that careful, guarded composure of hers. "Then what do you have?" Emmett thought about that. Really thought about it, standing in the yard with his ribs aching, and his father's ghost pressing in close, and a dead man's name still rattling around loose in his skull. "A friend who owes me a debt he's spent years trying to pay back," he said. "And a foreman who isn't as dead as everybody in this valley thinks he is." Suyin's eyes sharpened. "Pruitt. Pruitt. And if he cannot help," Suyin said, "if whatever reason he had for giving me this house has nothing to do with proof, or money, or anything that stops a clock already running, then we're no worse off than we are standing here right now," Emmett said. "But I don't believe that's the case. A man doesn't fake his own death and hide 6 years in this valley over nothing at all. Something happened out here bad enough to make Silas Pruitt, who I once watched face down a rattler with nothing but a stick, and better sense than fear, run and keep running for 6 straight years. I aim to find out what. You think he can help?" "I think," Emmett said, slowly. "He already has. He gave you this house when he had no right to. Man doesn't do that without a reason, and I aim to find out what it is." Suyin studied him a long moment, something careful and searching in her expression. "You are afraid," she said. "Not an accusation. Simply an observation, offered the same flat, certain way she offered most things. Man would be a fool not to be," Emmett admitted. $1,200 I don't have. A dead man who isn't. Riders who'd just as soon put me through a fence as look at me." He shook his head. 10 years I told myself fear was a young man's weakness. Something I'd burned out of myself 2 territories over. Turns out it was just waiting for something worth being afraid for. "That is not weakness," Suyin said. "That is the difference between a man protecting nothing and a man protecting something." Opid. "I would trust the second man a great deal more than the first, in a fight." Emmett looked at her a moment, something in his chest loosening slightly at the plain, unhurried certainty of it. Where'd you get to be so sure of things? I am not sure of things, Suyin said. I am only decided. It is a different matter entirely, and a good deal more useful in a valley like this one. The telegraph office in Ironwood was small, hot, smelling of ink and hot metal. Emmett stood at the counter a long time, composing the words in his head before he ever picked up the pencil. A telegram was a desperate throw into the dark, expensive, uncertain, and it was the only shot he had that didn't require him to find Pruitt inside of 2 days. He wrote it Stark, because Stark was cheaper and because there wasn't one time for anything else. Need backing against land seizure. Water rights at stake. Your terms. Callaway. Address Dus Kessler, care of Kessler Shipping, San Francisco. Before leaving town that same afternoon, he stopped at the Bank of Ironwood, a narrow brick building squeezed between the saloon and a boarded-up storefront, to ask of what wire transfer might look like should Schesker actually send funds. The teller, a nervous young man who kept glancing toward the window, as though expecting Drummond himself to walk in and object, explained the process in a hushed voice, and confirmed, unprompted, something Emmett hadn't thought to ask. Territorial tax debts have to be paid in full, all at once, Mr. Callaway, the teller said. No partial payments accepted against a seizure notice. It's all or it's nothing, by the marshal's own paperwork. All or nothing. The words settled into Emmett's chest like one more stone added to a pile, already too heavy to carry comfortably. Even if Kessler wired everything he owned, anything short of the full 1,250 would count, in the eyes of the law, for exactly as much as nothing at all. He paid the telegraph clerk with what felt like the last of his dignity and most of his coin, and stood there a moment while the machine clicked out, his desperation into wire and current, off toward a city he hadn't seen in years, to a man whose life, a dockside brawl that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with bad whiskey and worse luck, on a night Emmett rarely let himself think about in any detail beyond the bare fact of it. A knife. A crowd of men who meant Kessler's serious harm. A choice made in about a second and a half, the kind of choice a man doesn't examine too closely afterward for fear of what he might find underneath it. He'd never planned to collect on debt. He was about to find out if Amos Kessler remembered owing it. That still left the other half of the problem. The half a telegram couldn't fix even if San Francisco answered by morning. Because even if Kessler sent every dollar he had, it wouldn't undo the fact that Drummond had rigged this whole valley like a crooked card table, and Emmett had no proof of it. No proof about the tax debt being manufactured. No proof about his father. Nothing but a drunk man's story and a green line of cottonwoods and a feeling in his gut that had never once, in 10 hard years, steered him wrong. He needed Pruitt. Not for money. For truth. Before they left town, Emmett stopped once more at the general store, the same stooped shopkeeper, glancing up from behind the counter with that same careful expression from the day before. Line shack up past the North Ridge, Emmett said, low. Old cattle shelter, my father's men used to use it. You know it. The shopkeeper's hands went still on the counter. I know of it, he said, dead, carefully. Haven't been up that way myself in years. Rocky trail. Easy to lose a horse's footing if you don't know it well. He glanced down at his own flour-dusted hands a moment, weighing something. My brother-in-law lost a mare up that grade once, years back. Never did find good footing again after a man like Drummond got done squeezing this valley dry. Funny, the things that come to a man's mind when somebody finally asks the right question out loud. Anybody living up there these days that you've heard? The man's eyes flicked just once, toward the window, toward the street outside, and back again. I hear things, Mr. Callaway. I don't always repeat them. A pause, weighted, deliberate. But I will say this much. A man who wanted to disappear in this valley and still keep half an eye on it, that shack wouldn't be the worst choice he could make. Close enough to watch the smoke over a certain chimney. Far enough, nobody'd think to look. It wasn't confirmation. But it wasn't nothing either, and Emmett understood. Walking back out into the street, that fear alone hadn't stopped every soul in Ironwood from noticing things, from quietly, carefully, keeping track of a truth they didn't dare speak above a whisper. Before the light failed that evening, Emmett walked the perimeter of the yard with a hammer and a fistful of nails, was shoring up the weak points in the fence, bracing the barn door with a second bar. The quiet, unglamorous work of a man making a place a little harder to hurt. Suyin worked alongside him, without being asked, hauling water, checking the goats twice over, moving through the failing light with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything. You expect them back tonight, she said, holding a board steady while he drove the nails home. I expect Drummond doesn't sleep easy, knowing there's a woman on this porch who isn't afraid of him, Emmett said. Man like that, being defied twice in one day by two different people, he won't let that sit long. Then we will not sleep easy either, Suyin said. Not frightened. Just factual, folding the coming danger into the evening's chores, the same way she folded everything else, without complaint, without drama, simply making room for it. A single rider came up the road, just as the light was starting to fail, and Emmett's hand went to the shotgun, before he recognized the lean, unhurried shape of Marshal Reuben Hargrove. Alone this time, no Drummond riding beside him, no column of men at his back. Marshal, Emmett said, wary, stepping down off the porch. Didn't expect you back before your 48 hours were up. I'm not here official, Hargrove said, and something in the way he said it, careful, a little uneasy, told Emmett this visit was costing the man something to make. He didn't dismount, sat his horse at the edge of the yard, like a man who hadn't quite decided whether he belonged there. Wanted to ask you something, off the record. Seeing as there's no record being kept out here tonight, ask it. That tax debt, Hargrove said. 10 years unpaid, all at once, discovered the same week you ride back into this valley. That sit right with you, as a coincidence. No, Emmett said, it doesn't. Hargrove was quiet a moment, looking out over the yard, the mended fence, the goat pen, the woman standing steady on the porch behind Emmett, with a shotgun she plainly knew how to use. I've served this territory 11 years, he said finally. Enforced a great many notices I didn't examine as closely as maybe I should have. A man tells himself, the paperwork's the paperwork, and the paperwork's not his to question, only his to serve. He shifted in the saddle, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the horse beneath him. I'm not saying I believe you over Josiah Drummond. Man's paid taxes and kept his nose clean in this territory a long while. I'm saying I've started noticing how many of his neighbors' fortunes seem to run the opposite direction his does, and a lawman who doesn't ask himself why, sooner or later, isn't much of a lawman at all. Why tell me this? Emmett asked. Instead of just doing your job and letting the paper run its course. Hargrove looked at him a long moment, and for the first time since Emmett had met him, something like genuine trouble crossed the marshal's carefully blank face. You've got a right to know something else, Hargrove added, before Emmett could press further. Your father filed a complaint with my predecessor the year before he died. Formal complaint against Drummond over the water rights pressure. I found it filed and forgotten in a drawer my first month on the job. Never thought much of it at the time. Territories full of neighbor disputes that never amount to anything. I think of it different now. I think a man tried to do this the honest way first, and the honest way got him killed for the trouble. Emmett stood very still. Why didn't you tell me that sooner? Because I only remembered it myself 2 nights back, going through old files after your father's name came up twice in 1 week, for the first time in years, Hargrove said. A lawman who's been comfortable a long while gets slow at connecting things he ought to connect faster. I'm not proud of that, but I'm telling you now, which is more than most men in my position would manage. He paused a moment, looking out over the darkening yard. And because I'd rather be the kind of marshal who asks the hard question a little late than the kind who never asks it at all, he added. If you find something, Calloway, bring it to me straight and public. I'll follow the proof wherever it leads. That's the only promise I've got to give you tonight. He turned his horse, without waiting for a reply, and rode back toward town, and Emmett stood, a long while in the yard, watching him go, turning the visit over the way. He'd turned over everything else this valley had handed him. You believe him? Suyin asked, from the porch. I believe, Emmett said slowly, that a man doesn't ride out alone after dark to tell a stranger something that could cost him his badge, unless some part of him has already decided which side of this he means to land on, whether he knows it himself yet or not. They ate a quiet supper by lamplight once the work was done, and afterward Emmett found himself telling her, without quite meaning, too, about the pocket watch on the mantel, about the two initials worn smooth by his father's thumb, and Suyin listened the way she seemed to listen to everything, fully, without hurrying him, toward the end of it. He'll have gone somewhere he knows, she said finally, as they moved to the small table with a map of the valley Emmett's father had kept tacked to the wall of the tack rooms. For 30 years, half of it faded past reading. Somewhere he trusted before he trusted no one. You said he found you at the depot. He did. But he did not live at the depot. She traced a finger along the map, slow, thoughtful. He spoke once of a line shack. Up past the North Ridge, he said it was where your father's men used to shelter cattle in bad winters. He said it the way a man speaks of a place he has been recently, not a place from memory. Emmett stared at the map, at the thin, faded mark north of the ridge line, barely more than a smudge of old ink. In the same rough position, the shopkeeper's careful silence had pointed toward. You've been holding on to that, he said. This whole time. You did not ask, Suyin said. Simple, unapologetic. And I did not know until last night if you were a man worth telling. She said it plainly, without apology, the same unhurried honesty she brought to everything, the particular candor of someone who had long ago stopped softening true things for the comfort of the person hearing them. He looked at her a long moment, and now, she said, I think you might be. It wasn't much. It wasn't a declaration of anything, but it settled into Emmett's chest like a small, warm coal, and it stayed there the rest of the night, glowing quiet under everything else he had to carry. They rode out before first light because 48 hours doesn't wait for a man to feel rested, and because Emmett had learned a long time ago that the things worth doing rarely arrived on a convenience schedule. The trail north climbed hard and rocky, still slick in places from the night storm, switching back through stands of juniper that clawed at their sleeves, the air going thin and cold as the ridge rose up ahead of them. Suyin rode like she'd been born to it, which, Emmett supposed, given what he now knew about her father and the river, maybe in some fashion she had been. A different kind of hard country, same kind of person it made. They were perhaps 2 miles up when Emmett caught the sound of hooves on rock somewhere a bay below, and behind them, faint, easily mistaken for an echo of their own horses. If a man wasn't listening close, he wasn't inclined to trust an echo. He raised a hand, and Suyin drew up beside him, without a word, both of them still listening. The sound didn't come again. Might have been nothing. A deer, startled off a ledge, a rockfall settling somewhere in the heat of the climbing sun. But Emmett sat a long moment with his hand resting easy near, though not on, the old shotgun lashed across his saddle, and didn't move on until he was as satisfied as a man could be in country like this that nothing was behind them but stone and silence. You heard it too, Suyin said, once they'd started forward again. Might have been nothing. You do not believe that. No, he admitted. I don't. They stopped once, near the halfway point, where a shelf of rock threw a narrow ribbon of shade across the trail, and let the horses blow A few minutes in the growing heat. Su Qian passed him, the water skin, without a word, and he drank and passed it back, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just sat in the thin shade catching their breath. The whole valley spread out gold and merciless below them. "You never asked me to teach you the shotgun properly," Emmett said, watching her check the cinch on her saddle with the same careful economy she brought to everything. "You handle it like you already know, mostly. But there's a trick to the recoil that'll save your shoulder some bruising. You care to learn it." "I would care to learn it," Suyin said, and there was something almost pleased in the admission. The particular pleasure of a person unused to being offered anything without a cost attached. He showed her right there in the thin shade how to set her forward instead her weight palm instead of back, how to let the stock ride high against the meat of the shoulder instead of the bone, and she listened with the same close, patient attention she gave to everything, asking two sharp questions that told him she'd understood the mechanics of it faster than most men he'd taught back in his rougher years. "There," he said. "Next man fool enough to test you, you'll feel it a good deal less in the morning." "A fair trade," she said, "for a windmill." They rode on, the day's heat pressing down harder with every mile, but something boom had shifted, small and unremarked upon, the particular ease of two people who had each given the other something useful and asked nothing further of it. "You didn't have to come," he said, somewhere past the halfway point, when the silence had gone on long enough that it needed breaking. "I know. Could have stayed at the ranch. Safer. Could I?" He didn't have an answer for that, because she wasn't wrong. Nowhere in this valley was safe right now, not for either of them, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. "Why'd you come then?" He pushed, because some stubborn part of him wanted to hear her say it. She considered the question a long moment, eyes on the trail ahead. "Because Mr. Pruitt gave me a home when he owed me nothing," she said, finally. "If he in trouble because of a kindness he showed me, I will not sit in a kitchen and wait to hear how it ended." Emmett rode quiet after that, because there wasn't a single thing he could say that would have improved on it. The line shack sat low and half hidden in a fold of rock, its roof sagging, its single width window boarded from the inside. Smoke rose thin from a chimney patched together with mud and scrap iron. Somebody was living rough up here. Somebody who didn't want to be found. Emmett dismounted a good distance out, left his horse tied to a juniper, walked the rest slow, hands visible, the way a man approaches something that might still have teeth. "Pruitt," he called. "It's Emmett Calloway." Silence. Then from inside, a voice gone thin and rusted with disuse. "Go away, boy. Whoever sent you, tell them you never found this place. Nobody sent me." Emmett stopped 10 feet from the door. "I found it myself. With some help." A long pause. "Is she with you?" the voice asked. "Careful. The woman." "I'm here, Mr. Pruitt," Suyin said, stepping up beside Emmett, her voice gentle in a way Emmett hadn't heard from her yet. Another long silence. Then the sound of a bar being lifted, slow, reluctant, and the door creaked open on a room lit by a single guttering lamp. Silas Pruitt had aged 20 years in the 10 Emmett had been gone. Hollowed out, gray to the roots. His hands shook faintly around the edge of the door, and his eyes, when they finally found Emmett's face, were wet and terrified, and something else underneath the terror, something that looked unmistakably like relief. "You've got your father's eyes," Pruitt said. His voice cracked clean in half on the last word. "Tell me why everyone in this valley thinks you're dead," Emmett said. Quiet, not unkind, but not gentle either. "Tell me why you gave a stranger my father's house. And tell me," his own voice caught, just slightly, before he forced it back level, "tell me what really happened to him." Pruitt's whole body seemed to fold inward. "You should sit down, son," he said. "Both of you. This is going to take a while. And, once I've said it, there's no putting it back." They sat on upturned crates in the low lamp light, while the wind worked at the boarded window and Silas Pruitt told them a story he'd been carrying alone for 6 years. Your daddy was a hard man to know. He began, before he even got to the storm, like he needed to build the man back up before he could tell them how he'd been taken apart. Hard to know, but not hard to trust, if that makes any sense to you. He didn't say much. Never was one for it. But he'd work a fence line beside you all day, in July heat, and never once complain. And when it was done, he'd hand you the better half of the water, without you even having to ask. Pruitt's eyes went distant, soft. I remember once, must have been your 14th summer, you took a bad fall breaking that colt he'd bought off the Hendersons. Cracked your collarbone clean through. He sat up with you 3 nights running, never said a soft word the whole time. Just kept the fire going, and the cold cloth changed. And on the 4th morning, when the fever finally broke, I heard him out on the porch alone, and I'll swear to my grave the man was crying, though he'd have denied it with his last breath if I'd ever mentioned it. Emmett's throat tightened. He hadn't remembered that. Or maybe he had, buried somewhere under 10 years of not wanting to remember any of Evanet. He used to talk about you, you know. Pruitt went on. After you left. Never to your face. God knows, wasn't his way. But out checking the herd, he'd go quiet a long while, and then say something like, "Wonder if the boy's eating regular. Wonder if he's found somewhere warm to sleep." Never said he missed you. Man like that never would have said the word. But I heard it plain enough underneath. Emmett's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Some things a person has to let land all the way before they can speak around them again. It was a storm, Pruitt continued. Spring of '76. Worst one I'd seen in that valley, in 30 years of living in it. Lightning splitting the sky wide open, thunder that shook the water right out of the trough. He stared at his own hands like they belonged to somebody else. Your father had told Drummond no. Final time. Drummond had come by that same week, all smiles and numbers, offering to buy the water rights outright. And your father, you remember how he was. Emmett, your father laughed in the man's face. He always did hate being told what his land was worth, Emmett said, his voice barely above the wind. That night, Pruitt continued, I heard riders. Out past the north pasture, in the middle of that storm, which nobody with a lick of sense would be riding in, unless they had a reason that couldn't wait. I went out to see. Your father was already out there, arguing with 2 of Drummond's men. He stopped, swallowed. I saw it, Emmett. I saw the whole thing from the tree line. I was too far to stop it, and God help me, I was too scared to try. Emmett's whole body had gone very still. They didn't mean to kill him, Pruitt said, and his voice broke properly now, the words coming out ragged. I believe that much. I think it started as a beating meant to scare him into signing. But your father fought back. He always fought back. And in that storm, in the dark, with lightning turning everything into flashes and shadow, one of them hit him wrong, hit him hard, and he didn't get back up. The wind screamed against the boarded window. Nobody spoke for a long moment. They buried him, Pruitt said, out past the ridge, where nobody would think to dig. And they made sure the story that got told in town was a man lost in a storm. Gone, nobody ever found. Easy enough to believe given the weather that night. And you, Emmett said. His own voice sounded strange to him, distant, like it belonged to somebody standing a few feet away. You saw it, and you said nothing. I was terrified, son. Pruitt looked up, and there were tears, cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. Drummond's men saw me in those trees. I know they did. I ran that same night, and I didn't stop running until I was 3 valleys over, and I let this whole territory believe I'd died of a fever because a dead man can't be made to testify. A dead man is safe. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I've spent 6 years telling myself I was protecting your father's memory by staying quiet. Truth is, I was protecting my own miserable neck. I've had 6 years to sit with that, and I promise you, son, It does not get lighter with time. Only heavier. Every single year. Heavier. What were those 6 years? Emmett asked, quiet. Where'd you go? What'd you do with yourself? Hiding from a whole valley. Pruitt let out a long breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. First year, I didn't do much but run. Slept in line shacks and drive washes. Further out than this one. 3 valleys over, like I told you, working odd jobs under a name that wasn't mine, never staying anywhere long enough for a face to be remembered twice. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the gesture of a man revisiting a version of himself he wasn't proud of. Second year, I came back. Couldn't stay away, truth told. Found this shack, close enough to see the smoke over your father's chimney of an evening, and I told myself I was keeping watch, honoring his memory somehow, though mostly I think I was just too much of a coward to leave the last place that had ever felt like mine. And the other 4 years, Emmett pressed. The other 4 years I mostly hated myself, Pruitt said, simply. Watched that house sit empty and rotting from a distance, same as I was rotting up here, and told myself there was nothing to be done about either. Then I saw her. He nodded toward Suyin, sitting on that station bench with nowhere to go, and nothing left to lose, and it was like watching myself get a second chance I didn't deserve. And she surely did. I gave her the only thing I had left worth giving. Wasn't brave. Wasn't even especially kind, not really, since I never once told her the whole truth of why that house sat empty. Just seemed, at the time, like the small palpable of putting something right in a world I'd let go badly wrong. Then why the note? Suin asked gently, into the silence that followed. Why give me this home if you meant to stay hidden forever? Pruitt looked at her, like the question had cracked something open in him he hadn't expected to feel again. I watched you 3 days. Before I ever showed myself, he admitted, quiet, a little ashamed of the confession. From a distance. Wanted to be sure you weren't one of Drummond's. Sent to draw me out. Watched you walk into that depot with nothing but a bundle and a black shawl and a look on your face like the world had already done its worst, and you were still deciding whether to let it win. He shook his head slow. You never once looked like you were deciding to give up, just deciding what to do next. I hadn't seen that particular look on anybody in a long while. Made me think of your father, Emmett, if I'm honest. The mornings after he'd taken a bad loss on cattle prices and got up anyway to do the chores same as any other day. Because a man can only carry so much guilt before he has to put some of it down. He continued. I couldn't undo what happened to Jonas. I couldn't. But I could make sure that house didn't sit empty and rotting, same as his memory was rotting in me. I could put a soul back in it, even if it wasn't mine to give. He looked at her a long moment. You reminded me of somebody who'd lost about as much as a person can lose, and kept standing, anyway. I figured the house could use that kind of company. Turns out I was right, though I never expected the boy himself to come home and find you there. Emmett sat with that a long while. Grief and fury, and something that felt almost like relief. The strange, terrible relief of finally knowing, after 10 years of not knowing, exactly what shape his father's absence had taken. There was a particular mercy in it, he realized, even amid the horror, the mercy of no longer having to wonder, no longer having to carry a question mark where a grave should have been. Drummond's men, he said finally. Do you know who? I know one, Pruitt said. Older of the two. Silver at the temples, scar along his jaw, where a mule once caught him with a shod hoof. Ugly business. Long before any of this. Goes by Tate now. Works close to Drummond still. I'd wager the other one's dead or gone. Way these things usually go once they've outlived their use to a man like Drummond. Emmett went very still. Scar along the jaw, he said. Favors his left leg getting on and off a horse. Pruitt's eyebrows lifted. You've met him. Twice, Emmett said. Something cold settling into his chest. Once on the road into town. Once in my own yard, trying to scatter Suyin's goats and put me through a fence post. He shook his head slow. small valley. Would Tate talk? If it came to it, Emmett asked after a moment. Pruitt shook his head slow, not willingly. Not while Drummond's paying his wages and holding whatever leverage keeps a man quiet for 6 years running. Emmett rubbed a hand over his face, because knowing the truth and proving the truth were two very different mountains, and he'd only just finished climbing the first one. Is there anything? He asked. Anything written? Anything besides your word? And a story nobody in that valley wants to believe. Pruitt was quiet a long moment. Then he rose, slow, joints cracking, and crossed to a loose board in the shack's back wall, pried it free, reached into the dark space behind it, and drew out a small oilskin packet, worn soft at the folds from years of handling. I kept this, he said, same reason I'd kept breathing all these years. Some stubborn part of me that wasn't ready to let it all disappear. He looked at the packet a long moment before handing it over, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried. So long he'd nearly forgotten what his hands felt like without it. Carried it through 3 moves, 2 floods, and 1 bad winter where I nearly burned it for kindling, just to keep from freezing. Never could bring myself to do it. Told myself, every single time, that Jonas deserved better than to have the truth of him go up in smoke, same as his own body never properly did. He handed it to Emmett. Inside, folded tight, were pages torn from an old ledger. Drummond's own hand, unmistakable, even faded, recording the same scheme Emmett had just watched play out in a land office that very morning. Falsified tax records, manufactured debts, a list of names, Calloway, among them, though not the only one. Each entry a small, cold catalog of somebody's ruin dressed up as ordinary bookkeeping. The pages themselves were unremarkable to look at. Cheap ledger stock, gone brittle and brown at the edges. The kind of paper any land office in the territory might use for its ordinary business. It was the columns that told the story. Debs recorded in one ink, then quietly amended in another. Dates altered just enough to push a payment outside its grace period. Penalties compounding on penalties until an honest family's small, manageable arrears became, on paper, an impossible mountain. Drummond's hand grew more confident with each entry. Emmett noticed the strokes bolder, more assured, a man who had started this scheme nervous and finished it comfortable, even proud of his own careful arithmetic. Emmett's father hadn't been Drummond's first target. He wasn't even close to being the last. There's 4 other families in these pages, Pruitt said quietly. Every one of them lost their land, lost the same way you're about to. Same trick, same 48 hours. The Ostranders lost their north 42 years back, right around the time their eldest boy took sick and they had no spare money to fight a tax bill they didn't understand and couldn't afford a lawyer to question. The Whitfields, more recent, just last spring, a young family with a baby, easiest kind of target for a man like Drummond, too worn down with new parenthood to have the fight left in them. The Perrys lost their well rights to some invented survey error nobody could ever get a straight answer about. Old Ezra Cotter, whose barn got split by lightning that same spring. Though I always wondered, since if that particular bit of misfortune came from the sky or from somebody wanting a distraction that night, and your father, first of them all, best I can figure, and the only one who ever told Drummond no, and meant it enough to die for meaning it. Emmett stared at the names, at the pattern laid bare in a hiding man's careful, guilty handwriting. This is enough, he said, and his voice had gone hard, certain, the voice of a man who had just found solid ground under his feet for the first time in 10 years. Is enough to end him. He sat with the pages a long moment, the lamp guttering low, and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't been there 10 minutes before. Not peace, exactly. Something closer to purpose, the particular, clean weight of finally knowing what a man's hands were for after years of not being entirely sure. They left the shack as the light was starting to fail. Pruitt's oilskin packet, Protect Calm packet, tucked deep inside Emmett's coat. close to his chest, like something he could protect just by keeping it near a beating heart. "Come with us," Emmett had said before they mounted. "You've hidden long enough." But Pruitt had shaken his head. "Not yet, son. If Drummond finds out I'm alive before you've got that proof somewhere safe, he'll do to me what he did to your father, and he'll make sure this time there's truly no body left to argue about. Get it somewhere it can't be burned or buried. Then come back for me. I've waited 6 years for this. I can wait one more night." It had seemed, at the time, like the careful, sensible plan of a man who'd survived 6 years by being careful and sensible. They were 3 miles down the North Trail, the light nearly gone, when Emmett first felt it. That old, cold prickle at the back of his neck that 10 years of dangerous living had taught him never to ignore. "We're being watched," he said low. Suyan's hand went still on her reins. "How long?" "Don't know. Maybe since the shack." A quarter-mile on, the trail dipped through a narrow wash, lined with brush, and it was there. Emmett caught the shape of a rider, still and half-hidden, among the scrub oak on the far bank, watching their approach. He didn't slow, didn't change his pace by so much as a breath, though every nerve in him had gone tight and bright, with old, familiar warning, the particular clean, quiet alertness he hadn't felt in years, and had almost foolishly missed. "Don't look," he said, low, to Suyan. "Rider, 10 o'clock. In the brush. Might be nothing. Might be one of Drummond's." She didn't look. Kept her eyes forward, her posture easy, the particular discipline of a person who had learned, somewhere in a life that had asked a great deal of her, how to hide fear behind stillness. They rode past the wash at the same unhurried pace, and the rider didn't follow, didn't so much as shift in his saddle, and Emmett understood, once they'd put a mile of empty trail behind them, that the man hadn't been there to stop them, to report, which was, in its own way, a good deal more unsettling than an outright attack would have been. They kept riding, steady, unhurried, the way you move when you don't want whoever is out there to know you've made them. Emmett's mind raced ahead of his horse's hooves, turning the possibilities over fast and cold, because if someone had followed them up that trail, they knew exactly where the line shack was, which meant Pruitt's careful, sensible plan to stay hidden a little while longer had a hole in it the size of a canyon, and Emmett was 3 miles away and closing the wrong direction, with proof in his coat that could bring down the most powerful man in the valley, and no way at all to get back to the one man who just handed it to him. They didn't make it back to the ranch until well past dark, before either of them thought about rest. Before either of them thought about, Emmett went through the house methodically, by lamplight, checking every window latch, every door bar, laying the old shotgun within reach of the spot by the hearth where he meant to sit, watch, and a second, smaller pistol he'd found in his father's old chest, cleaned and oiled, though it hadn't been fired in years, within reach of the room that had once been his mother's. "You know how to use this?" he asked, setting it on the small table by her door. "Or would you rather I teach you proper, same as the shotgun?" "I know how," Suyan said, checking the cylinder with a practiced economy that told him the question had been unnecessary. "My husband believed a woman alone on the railroad camps should not be defenseless." He was not wrong, as it turned out, though not in the way either of us expected the danger to come from. Emmett nodded, said nothing further, and went to sit by the window, with his father's old shotgun across his knees, running the numbers on a clock that had already burned through most of its 48 hours, turning the oilskin packet over and over. In his hands, like the act of touching it might make the proof inside more real, more solid, less likely to slip away from him the way everything else in this valley seemed determined to do. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Suyan found him there, sometime near midnight. Didn't say anything, at first. Just sat down across from him, close enough that the silence between them stopped being lonely and started being something else. "You think they saw you?" she said finally. "At the shack." "I think," Emmett said slowly, "that A man like Drummond doesn't leave anything to chance. Not when this much is on the line. If they find him, she said, before we can move him somewhere safer. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Both of them sat, with the unfinished shape of it, a long while, the fire burning low. The house settling around them in the particular quiet that follows a storm, both the kind that comes from the sky and the kind that doesn't. Can I ask you something? Emmett said, after a while. That isn't about Drummond, or Pruitt, or any of it. Su-Yin looked at him, something careful and curious in her expression. You may ask, that river your father fished. Ever think about going back to it? You ever think about going back to it? She considered the question a long time, the fire popping softly between them. Every year, for a long time, I thought of little else, she said. Now I think of it the way you think of a room in a house you no longer live in, fondly, without wanting to go back inside. She looked at him. Is that an answer to what you were truly asking? Maybe, Emmett admitted. I think I was asking whether a person can put down roots twice in one lifetime. After losing the first set, I think, Su-Yin said quiet. We are both, at this moment, in the middle of finding out. Neither of them said anything else for a long while after that. They didn't need to. The fire burned low, and the house held them both, and somewhere, out past the ridge, the last of the storm finally, fully let go of the sky. He was right to worry about Drummond. Because, at that same hour, 3 miles north and 1 ridge over, a rider was already pushing his hard toward Ironwood, carrying word to Josiah Drummond that the ghost he'd buried 6 years ago in a spring storm was not only alive. He'd had visitors, and by morning, Drummond would know exactly whose visitors they'd been. Dawn broke gray and cold over the valley, and it brought with it the sound of hard, urgent hoofed beats coming fast up the road from town. Not 2 riders this time, not 3, but a whole column of them. Drummond himself at the head, his face no longer wearing its careful, practiced smile. Emmett stepped out onto the porch, the oilskin packet still tucked close inside his coat. Su-Yin, a silent, steady presence at his shoulder. The pistol from his father's chest tucked plain and visible at her hip now, no longer hidden away in a bedroom drawer. Drummond's eyes caught on it a half-second longer than they needed to, some small flicker of recalculation crossing his face at the sight of a woman he'd dismissed 2 mornings running, now standing armed and unflinching beside the man he'd come to threaten. Calloway, Drummond called out, reining in hard enough to make his horse dance sideways. His voice had lost every trace of its oily warmth. What remained underneath was something far more dangerous. Seems you've been keeping company with a dead man. Emmett said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't hand Drummond information he didn't already have. I want him, Drummond said. I want Pruitt, and I want whatever he's been hiding all these years, and I want it before that clock of ours runs out. His eyes cut, sharp and cold, toward Su-Yin, then back to Emmett. You've got until sundown now, Calloway. Not 48 hours. Sundown. You bring me the old man, or I promise you, this valley is about to lose one more Calloway the same way it lost the last one. He wheeled his horse and rode hard back toward town, his men falling in behind him, and the dust they left hanging in the cold morning air felt, to Emmett, exactly like the opening line of a threat that had stopped being veiled at all. Su-Yin watched them go a long moment, her hand still resting easy near the pistol at her hip, before she spoke again. He is frightened, she said. A man who threatens that plainly, in front of witnesses, has already begun losing his grip on the careful game he was playing before. Frightened men are the dangerous kind, Emmett said. More dangerous than careful ones, sometimes. A careful man calculates. A frightened man just swings. Somewhere north of the ridge, in a half-hidden line shack with a boarded window, a frightened old man was sitting on 6 years of guilt and the only proof in the territory that could bring Josiah Drummond down. And Josiah Drummond now knew exactly where to start looking. Emmett turned to Suyin, found her already watching him, steady, unafraid, the same way she'd been standing on that porch the very first day he'd ridden into this valley, meaning to sell it and leave. "We're out of time to be careful," he said. Then she said, "We stopped being careful." Behind them, the sun was climbing fast into a hard white sky, and somewhere out past the ridge, the clock that had once read 48 hours had just become something far crueler and far shorter. A single day, a single sundown, and a debt 6 years overdue that was finally, terribly, coming due. The clock had a new shape now, sundown. One day, cut down from two, and no way of knowing how many hours had already burned off it while Emmett stood on his own porch trying to decide which direction to ride first. Because there were two threads pulling at him and only one of him to follow them. Pruitt, alone, unguarded, sitting on proof that could end Drummond 3 miles north in a shack. Drummond's men now knew the location of and the telegraph office in Ironwood, where an answer from Amos Kessler might already be sitting in a drawer, waiting. "Pruitt first," Suyin said, already tightening the cinch on her saddle, before Emmett had finished the thought out loud. "A telegram can wait a few hours. A man cannot." She wasn't wrong. She was rarely wrong. Emmett was starting to notice, in the particular way of people who'd already lost too much to waste time being wrong about anything else. They rode north hard, the horses lathered before they'd covered half distance. The mornings could burning off into a white, merciless heat that made the whole ridge shimmer like something not quite solid. They were less than a mile from the shack when Emmett caught a flash of movement, low along a rock shelf to their left. A rider, still watching, gone again behind an outcrop before Emmett could be sure of what he'd seen. He reined up hard, hand dropping instinctively to the old shotgun, and Suyin drew alongside him without a word, both of them scanning the rocks. Nothing moved. No sound but wind combing through juniper and the tick of cooling stone. They waited a long moment, both horses shifting restless beneath them, ears pricked toward the same silence Emmett was straining against. A hawk cried somewhere far overhead, thin and indifferent to anything happening below it. Still nothing moved among the rocks. "Drummond's man," Emmett said low. "Or my nerves playing tricks. Can't say which." "Does it matter now?" Suyin asked. "Either way, we keep moving." They pressed on, faster now, the particular urgency of people who have stopped pretending they have time to spare, and Emmett knew before they crested the last rise. Knew it in the same place he'd known, riding into this valley 3 days ago, that the smoke over his father's house meant somebody had made it a home. Some instinct older than thinking, some low animal certainty that it arrived a full 10 seconds before the eyes caught up. The shack door was open, hanging crooked on one hinge, which meant it hadn't been opened, it had been kicked. Inside, the lamp was overturned. The floorboard where Pruitt had hidden his oilskin packet stood pried up and empty, though that didn't matter now, because the packet itself was safe inside Emmett's coat, close to a heart that was beating too hard too fast. What mattered was the chair on its side, the scuff marks dragged clean across the dirt floor toward the door, the single dark stain, still tacky, on the boards near the threshold. Not enough blood to mean the worst. Enough to mean it had been a fight. "They took him," Suyin said. Quiet. Steady. Even now, though Emmett could hear the effort it cost her to keep it that way. "They took him," Emmett agreed. He crouched by the doorway, ran a finger near the stain without touching it, the way a man reads a trail he doesn't want to be reading. Boot prints, at least 3 sets, one horse tied close enough to load a man onto it fast. This morning, maybe 2 hours old, maybe less, because Drummond hadn't ridden up to that porch at dawn to threaten Emmett into fetching Pruitt. He'd ridden up to buy himself an alibi while his men were already 3 miles north doing the fetching themselves. The rider on the rock shelf, Emmett understood now. hadn't been watching them at all. He'd been watching the shack, waiting to see if anyone came looking, reporting back on exactly how much Emmett already knew. Emmett straightened. Something in his chest had gone very cold and very clear. The particular clarity that used to arrive right before trouble, back when trouble had been his whole profession. He looked at the ransacked room a long moment, at the overturned lamp and the dragged chair and the single stubborn coal still glowing faint in the hearth, refusing even now to go entirely cold. "We're not waiting for sundown," he said. "No," Suyin agreed. "We are not." On the ride back down, an idea began to take shape in Emmett's mind, rough at first, then sharper with every mile. Pruitt's ledger held 4 other names besides Calloway, 4 other families who'd lost land or were losing it, to the same manufactured debt, the same 48-hour trap dressed up in official paper. Drummond had gotten this far in the valley by making sure every Faustemos alone, isolated, ashamed, certain that nobody else would believe a word against a man who wore a clean suit and sat in the only chair in the land office like he owned the whole territory. Nobody else had ever had proof. "The Ostranders," Emmett said, half to himself. Pruitt named them. "And the Whitfields. They lost land the same way I'm about to." "You think they will stand with you?" Suyin asked. "Against a man who has frightened this whole valley for years. I think," Emmett said, "a man alone is easy to ignore. 4 families with the same proof in their hands, standing together in the middle of that town, is a good deal harder to ride past." They stopped first at the Ostranders' place, a modest spread on the valley's eastern edge, where a gray-haired woman named Martha Ostrander listened to Emmett's account with her jaw tightening by degrees, her husband silent beside her, working his hat, brim through his hands like he was trying to wring the last 6 years out of it. "We always knew," Martha said finally, low, bitter. "Knew in our bones that debt wasn't honest. Paid what we could, and lost the North 40 anyway, and told ourselves there was nothing to be done about a man with the marshal's ear." She looked at the oilskin packet Emmett held out, at her own family's name, written plain in Drummond's hand, and her hand went briefly to her mouth. "6 years I've carried the shame of that loss like it was ours to be ashamed of. 6 years. It was never yours to carry," Suyin said, quiet, and Martha Ostrander looked at her a long moment, something passing between the two women that needed no further words. "You've got proof," Martha said to Emmett. "I've got proof," Emmett said. "What I need is people standing beside me when I use it. A man can call one family's grief a grudge. He's got a harder time calling 5 families a coincidence." Martha Ostrander looked at her husband a long moment. Something passed between them that needed no words at all. "We'll be in town by midday," she said, "and we'll bring the Perrys too, if you'll have them. Lost their well rights to Drummond 3 summers back on some claim about a survey error. Never made a lick of sense to any of us, but nobody had proof to say otherwise." Her husband finally spoke, low and rough, like the words had been sitting unused a long time. "6 years I've watched Josiah Drummond ride past this house like he owned the ground it sits on. Never once did anything about it but grit my teeth and keep working. I'm obliged to you, Calloway, for giving me a reason to do something else with the grinding." "Wasn't just me," Emmett said. "Wouldn't have found any of it without Sushin holding on to a scrap of a map and an old man brave enough to keep proof he was scared to death of getting caught holding." Martha Ostrander looked at Sushin a long moment, something warm and assessing in her gaze. "You're the one living out at the old Calloway place. Heard talk of you in town. Not always kind talk, I'm sorry to say." "I have grown used to unkind talk," Suyin said simply, without bitterness. "Well," Martha said, "you won't get any more of it from this family. Not after today." And she meant it plainly enough that Suyin, for the first time since Emmett had known her, looked briefly, genuinely surprised. The Whitfields, a younger couple, with a baby not yet a year old, said much the same, quieter, more frightened, but no less resolved, once they'd seen their own name on Drummond's careful, damning page. The young father, Daniel Whitfield, held the ledger page a long moment before handing it back, his jaw working, his wife's hand tight around his free arm. I told my wife for 3 years running that debt must have been some mistake on our part, he said. Told her we must have missed a payment somewhere. Some notice that never reached us. She never believed it. I think some part of me never did either. Just didn't have anywhere to put the not believing. He looked at Emmett. We'll be there. By the time Emmett and Suyin turned back toward Ironwood, word was already moving ahead of them, the particular fast, quiet current of news in a small valley where everyone has learned to listen more closely than they let on. The telegraph office in Ironwood was small, hot, smelling of ink and hot metal. Emmett stood at the counter a long time, though there was little time left to stand anywhere for long. The clerk recognized Emmett before he'd finished crossing the threshold, slid a folded paper across the counter without a word, the careful, sympathetic silence of a man who already knew what was written on it, and didn't envy the reading of it. Emmett unfolded it, standing right there, because waiting even one more minute felt like a luxury the day couldn't afford. $400, wired to Bank of Ironwood, all I could raise, on short notice. Forgive the shortfall. Come to San Francisco when this is owing you far more than money, old friend. Kessler $400. Against a debt of $1,250. Emmett stood there a moment, the paper trembling faintly in his own hand, and felt something in him that wasn't quite despair and wasn't quite relief. Some third thing that had no name, standing exactly at the point where hope runs out and a man discovers what he's actually made of underneath it. Because $400 didn't buy back a ranch. It didn't buy back a father. It sure as hell didn't buy back Silas Pruitt from wherever Drummond had him. It isn't enough, Suyin said, reading his face rather than the paper. No, Emmett said. It isn't. He folded the telegram once, twice, slid it into his coat next to the oilskin packet, 2 pieces of paper that between them held every ounce of leverage he had left in this whole world. Which means, he said, and his voice had gone quiet and hard and certain, in a way it hadn't been since he first rode into this valley, we stopped trying to buy our way out of this. Then what? Suyin asked. Then, Emmett said, we walk into that town and we make Drummond's own, sends the price he pays instead. Word travels calloused palms would, and it travels fast in a town the size of Ironwood. And it travels faster still when the man walk the middle of the street has a look on his face that says he's done being careful, and faster still than that, when 4 families arrive within the hour of one another, each carrying the same quiet, grim resolve. Emmett didn't go to the land office. He went to the square in front of it, where the general store and the bank and the saloon all faced each other across a stretch of dust, wide enough to hold a crowd. And he stopped there, in plain sight, and he called out Drummond's name loud enough to be heard through every open window on the street. Faces appeared in doorways. A few men drifted out onto porches, curious, cautious, the particular stillness of a town that has learned not to get involved in Josiah Drummond's business, unless business comes looking for them first. Martha Ostrander stood near the bank steps, her husband's hand in hers. The Whitfields stood closer to the saloon, Daniel holding their child against his shoulder, his jaw set hard in a way that suggested he'd decided, sometime in the last hour, that he was done being afraid in front of his own son. The Perrys arrived, just as the crowd was gathering, a lean, weathered couple who took up position without a word, simply standing, present, counted. Even the school teacher, a young woman Emmett didn't recognize, stepped out onto the boardwalk with a handful of her older students trailing behind her, curious, and did not usher them back inside, as though she too had decided this was a lesson worth letting them witness firsthand. Old Ezra Cotter, whose barn had been split by lightning that same spring 6 years back, stood near the water trough, leaning on a cane, watching everything with the sharp, unblinking attention of a man who had waited a long time for something and had finally decided it might be arriving. He'd farmed this valley longer than anyone left standing in it, had buried a wife and two brothers on this same stretch of ground, and had never once, in all his years, spoken a hard word against Josiah Drummond in public, telling himself, same as everyone else, that an old man's suspicions weren't worth the trouble of voicing against a man with the marshal's ear. He gripped his cane a little tighter now, watching, waiting to see whether this particular morning might finally be the one where suspicion got to stop buying just suspicion. The shopkeeper who'd sold Emmett coffee 2 mornings running stepped out from behind his own counter for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, arms crossed, watching from his doorway with an expression that had finally, visibly, stopped being careful. Drummond came out of the land office himself, unhurried, that oily smile sliding back into place like he'd never let it slip that morning at all. Calloway. He spread his hands, playing to the gathering crowd now, a performer who understood exactly what an audience was worth. Sun's not down yet. Man of your word, though, I see. Come to tell me you've changed your mind. I've come, Emmett said, loud, steady, pitched to carry, to tell this town what you did to my father, and to the Ostranders, and to the Whitfields, and to the Perrys, and to Ezra Cotter's barn, if I'm not mistaken about the timing of that particular storm. The crowd's murmur shifted, sharpened. Drummond's smile held. Barely. Grief does strange things to a man's imagination, son. Silas Pruitt isn't dead, Emmett said. He's been hiding in this valley for 6 years because he watched 2 of your men beat my father to death in a spring storm for refusing to sell his water rights. And this morning, your men found him and dragged him off, before he could tell anybody else what he told me. The shopkeeper stepped down off his own porch into the square proper, the first time Emmett had seen him leave that doorway in 3 days of passing by. I sold coffee to a Calloway 2 mornings running, and never once had the nerve to say I actually knew, he called out, his voice shaking but carrying. I asked what carrying, what copy to the Tgalon. But that debt was never honest. Everybody in this town who's ever kept books knew it in their gut. We just didn't have the proof, or the nerve, to say so out loud. The murmur became something else. Real. Alive. A crowd starting to understand it was standing in the middle of something. Lies, Drummond said, and there was real heat in it now, the polish finally cracking. Wild, grieving lies, and I'll have the marshal deal with a man who slanders decent citizens in the public street. Funny you should mention the marshal, Emmett said, because Reuben Hargrove was already there. Had come out onto the boardwalk somewhere in the last 30 seconds, drawn by the crowd the same as everyone else, and he was watching now with the particular careful stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't love the answer to. I've got proof, Marshal, Emmett said, turning to him, pulling the oilskin packet from his coat and holding it up where the whole street could see it. Drummond's own ledger, his own hand. 4 other families in this valley run off their land the exact same way mine's about to be. Falsified tax debts, manufactured seizures, and every single one of them sitting on water Drummond wanted for himself. That's fabricated. Drummond snapped, and the crack in his composure was widening now, showing something underneath that looked considerably less like a respectable businessman. That's a desperate man's forgery. Then let the marshal read it, Emmett said. In the daylight, in front of the whole town. If it's a forgery, you've got nothing to fear from that. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd at that. The particular murmur of people watching a bluff get called in real time, half of them leaning forward without quite meaning to, the whole square holding its breath together. And while he reads, Martha Ostrander called out, her voice carrying clear and sudden across the square. Surprising even herself, it seemed, by the steadiness of it. You can explain, too, all of us, why our name sits in your own ledger. Josiah Drummond, next to a debt we paid twice over and still lost land for. And ours, Daniel Whitfield added, his voice unsteady but his stance unmoving, his child still on his shoulder. 3 years, I told my wife. It must have been our own mistake. 3 years. A murmur of agreement moved through the small crowd, growing now, no longer just a murmur. Old Ezra Cotter thumped his cane once against the ground, sharp, deliberate. Same spring my barn burned, he said, loud enough for the whole square, and I never once thought to ask myself who might have wanted the whole valley, looking at lightning instead of asking harder questions. Silence stretched across the square, because Drummond's whole life had been built on people being too afraid, too small, too outmatched, to ever call that particular bluff, alone, one family at a time, one 48-hour clock at a time. Nobody ever had, until now, standing together, with proof in hand and nowhere left to look but at each other. Marshall Hargrove crossed the square slow, took the packet from Emmett's hand, and began to read. It didn't take him long. A minute, maybe 2. But Emmett watched something change in the man's face as he turned those pages, the flat, official blankness cracking apart, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous, the look of a lawman, realizing he'd been standing on the wrong side of a line for longer than he wanted to admit, and remembering, perhaps, a moment on a porch 2 days before when a woman had spoken up for herself and he'd simply folded his papers and written on. "Where's Pruitt now?" Hargrove said. Quiet. Not to the crowd. To Drummond directly, in a voice that had lost every trace of the careful neutrality it had carried on to that porch 2 days before. "I don't know what you're... Where is Pruitt?" And that was when a new sound cut through the square. A door banging open at the far end of the street, and a man came stumbling out of Drummond's own barn. Not Pruitt, but one of the 2 riders from that first night, the older one, gray at the temples, a thin, pale scar along his jaw, where a mule's hoof had caught him, long before any of this. The same man who'd blocked Emmett's path into town 3 days ago and driven him back into a fence post in his own yard that same evening, dragging himself forward now, like he'd been carrying a weight he could no longer stand to hold. "He's alive," Tate called out, his voice cracking across the whole square. "Pruitt. He's alive. He's in the back of that barn, tied up," and he stopped, swallowed, looked, for one long moment, directly at Drummond, and something in his face had finally, after 6 years, come apart. "I helped bury a man who wasn't even dead yet. I've carried that a long time, Marshall. Longer than I could stand." The square went dead silent. Drummond's face had gone the color of old ash. "Tate," he said low. "Dangerous. A warning dressed up as a name." "You don't know what you're..." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Tate said. His voice shook, but it didn't stop. "I was there that storm. I saw Jonas Calloway go down, and I saw him breathing after. And I heard you give the order not to fetch a doctor. I've lived with that 6 years, and I am done. I looked that boy in the eye twice now, once on the road and once in his own yard, and both times I thought about his father's eyes looking up at me out of the mud, and I am done carrying it, Josiah. I am done." Drummond moved fast, faster than a man his age and his soft, careful hands had any right to move. His coat falling open, his own pistol coming up in one smooth, practiced motion, and one held breath. The whole square froze around the sight of it. He wasn't aiming at Tate. He was aiming at Emmett. "You should have taken the $300, Drummond said, and his voice had lost every trace of oil now, scraped down to something raw and cornered, and genuinely dangerous. "You should have ridden east and left this valley to the people who actually understood how to run it." Emmett stood very still, because this was the moment. He knew it the way he'd known things in the old days, in the 2 seconds before a hand goes for iron, that particular, narrow slice of time where a man's whole life balances on what he chooses to do next. He could have gone for his own gun. He was close enough, fast enough, even 3 days rusty, that the old Emmett, the Emmett 2 territories over, had learned to fear, would have already finished this before Drummond's finger ever found the trigger. He didn't reach for a gun. Time did the strange, slow thing it always used to do in moments like this, stretching a half-second into something a man could walk around inside of, examine from every angle before it snapped back to its normal, merciless speed. He saw Drummond's finger tightening, saw the small, involuntary flinch in the man's shoulder that always came a fraction before the shot itself. Saw past Drummond's shoulder, Suyen's face still, steady, trusting him with something he hadn't fully earned yet, but intended to. He stepped forward instead. Inside the barrel's reach, inside the one place Drummond least expected to go, close enough to feel the heat coming off the man's coat, and closed his hand hard around the pistol before Drummond's shocked brain could catch up to what his body was doing. Twisted, wrist against wrist, the old motion coming back to him, whole and sure despite 10 years of rust, and the gun came free and clattered into the dust between, spinning once before it settled. Drummond staggered back, hands empty, eyes wide, the whole square staring at a man who had just watched his last piece of leverage hit the ground. Emmett stood over the fallen pistol. Didn't pick it up. "I could have killed you," he said quiet. Only for Drummond now, though the whole square could hear it anyway in that particular silence. "Same as your men killed my father. Same as you'd have done to me, given the chance." He held Drummond's gaze a long moment, letting the man understand exactly how close that choice had come, and exactly how deliberately he'd turned away from it. He nudged the pistol away with his boot, toward Hargrove, away from himself, away from Drummond. The gesture was small, almost casual, and yet the whole square seemed to understand, watching it, that they had just witnessed something considerably larger than the simple disarming of one frightened, cornered man. "But that's not the man I'm choosing to be anymore," Emmett said. "You're going to answer to the law. All of it. Every family in that ledger. That's a harder thing for a man like you to survive than a bullet ever would have been." Marshal Reuben Hargrove stepped forward and picked up the fallen pistol himself. "Josiah Drummond," he said, and his voice carried clean across the whole square. "Official again, but changed now. Changed for good. You're under arrest. Fraud. Conspiracy. And I expect, once Silas Pruitt's given his statement, considerably worse than that." He said it slow, deliberate, each word landing like a stone, set carefully into a wall that had been missing exactly this piece for 6 long years. The square erupted, not into chaos, but into something close to it. Relief and disbelief tangled together in 100 quiet conversations, breaking out at once. Martha Ostrander gripping her husband's arm, Daniel Whitfield's child startled, awake by the noise and beginning to cry against his father's shoulder, old Ezra Cotter thumping his cane against the ground over and over like a man trying to convince his own legs the moment was real. 2 of Hargrove's deputies moved in to take Drummond by thy arms, and the man went, finally, without another word. His whole bearing collapsed inward, the particular deflation of someone who has spent a lifetime performing power and has just discovered, in front of the one audience that mattered most, that the performance was over. They found Pruitt in the back of Drummond's own barn, tied to a support post, bruised, terrified, and very much alive. When Emmett cut the ropes free, the old man's legs gave out from under him, and it was Suyen who caught him, who lowered him down slow and gentle onto a bale of hay and pressed water to his cracked lips before he'd even managed to say a word, her hands moving over him, quick and practiced, checking for breaks, the same efficient way she'd checked Emmett's ribs 2 mornings before. The particular competence of someone who has learned, out of necessity, exactly how to tend a hurt person without wasting a single unnecessary motion. Nothing broken, she said, half to herself, half to Emmett. Once she'd finished, bruised badly, frightened worse. But he will heal. You came, Pruitt said, when he finally found his voice. I told you not to. I told you to be careful. I was done being careful, Emmett said. Turns out it wasn't working. Pruitt laughed. It came out half a sob. Your father used to say the same thing. Word for word. Stubborn as bedrock. Both of you. Emmett knelt down in front of him, looked the old man in the eyes, really looked, the way he hadn't quite managed to before, in the low lamplight of the shack, with the whole terrible story still fresh and raw between them. You saved a home for a woman who had nothing, Emmett said. You kept proof safe for 6 years, at the risk of your own neck, waiting for the day somebody might actually use it. I don't hold the running against you, Silas. Not anymore. He put a hand briefly on the old man's shoulder, the first time he'd touched him since arriving, and felt something pass between them that neither of them had words ready for. Pruitt's eyes went wet. Your father would be proud of who you turned into, he said. For what it's worth, coming from an old man who spent 6 years being far too much of a coward to say so. He wiped his face with the back of one trembling hand, half laughing at his own tears. Despite everything. It's worth plenty, Emmett said, and meant it. The days that followed moved fast, the way things do once a dam finally breaks. Hargrove took statements, from Tate, from Pruitt, from all 4 families, whose names filled Drummond's careful, damning pages. Each of them, one after another, finding it a great deal easier to speak the truth once they'd seen they wouldn't be speaking it alone. He worked long hours those first weeks, riding out to every affected homestead in person, rather than summoning families into town. A small courtesy Emmett suspected the marshal was extending as much for his own conscience as for anyone else's convenience, the particular penance of a man determined to make up, in diligence, for years of comfortable inattention. The territorial court in Carson City sent its own investigator within the month, a thin, precise woman named Constance Ayers, who spent 3 long days going through every page of every ledger Drummond had ever kept. She interviewed Emmett at the kitchen table, the same table where Pruitt's note had first been unfolded, asking careful, unhurried questions and writing his answers in a hand almost as neat as Drummond's own had been, though put, Emmett thought, to a considerably more honest purpose. Your father's case is the strongest of the 5, she told him, on her second afternoon, tapping the relevant page. Not because his loss was greater, because Pruitt witnessed it directly, and because Tate's testimony corroborates every material detail. Cases like Drummond's usually fall apart on exactly this point, the gap between what everyone in a valley suspects and what anyone is willing to say under oath. You close that gap. That's rarer than you might think in country like this. She set down her pen a moment, studying him. I've seen a great many valleys where the suspicion simply calcifies, generation after generation, and nobody ever quite manages the leap from knowing to proving. Yours didn't. I'd be curious, honestly, to understand exactly what tipped the balance. Wasn't just me, Emmett said, for what felt like the 100th time since the square. Wouldn't have closed anything without an old man brave enough to keep proof he was terrified of to keep proof upon, and a woman with sense enough to remember a line shack on a map nobody else thought to look at twice. Ayers glanced toward the window, where Suyin was visible in the garden, and something in her expression softened, briefly, from professional to simply human. I've read a great many fraud cases in this territory, she said. Most of them end the same way. One frightened family, alone, giving up before they ever get the chance to be right. This one didn't. I'd be curious to know why. Because nobody stayed alone long enough to give up, Emmett said, and found, saying it, that it was the truest thing he'd said all week. On her last afternoon in the valley, Ayers told him, folding her papers away, that she had rarely seen fraud laid out so plainly by the very hand that committed it. By the time the first real snow dusted the high peaks, Josiah Drummond was awaiting trial in a jail cell considerably less comfortable than the dark suit he'd once worn like armor. Tate testified against him in exchange for leniency, his own guilt, it seemed, a heavier sentence than anything the territory could have handed down. Large hands with calloused palms. The other rider from that spring storm 6 years back was never found, and Emmett found he didn't much care to spend more of his life hunting a ghost when he had a living, breathing, one still healing at his own table. Tate came by the ranch once, that autumn, before his own sentence sent him east to serve out a lesser charge for his part in the cover-up. Stood awkward at the edge of the yard, hat in hand, not quite able to meet Emmett's eyes. Didn't come for forgiveness, he said. Wouldn't know what to do with it if you offered it. Came to say I'm sorry, plain, for what it's worth, from a man who helped bury your father in a hole nobody was ever meant to find. He turned the hat over once, in his hands. He didn't suffer long. I've told myself that every day for 6 years, and I still don't know if it's true or just the thing I needed to believe to keep breathing. Emmett looked at him a long moment. There was no clean answer to give a man like that, no tidy forgiveness that wouldn't have been a lie. I don't forgive you, Emmett said finally. Don't know that it's mine to give, but I'll say this much. It took more spine to walk into that square and say what you said than it took Drummond his whole life to build that fortune on other men's grief. That's worth something. Might not be worth peace, but it's worth something. Tate nodded, once, and rode east that same week, and Emmett never heard from him again, though he found, in the months that followed, that he thought of the man less with anger than with a kind of weary, complicated pity, the particular pity reserved for someone who has spent years choosing the easier wrong over the harder wrong, right, and, finally too late to undo any of it, chosen otherwise. The tax debt, once examined by honest eyes, turned out to be exactly what Pruitt's ledger had promised. Manufactured. Void. Struck from the record entirely, along with the debts of the 4 other families whose land Drummond had been quietly stealing for the better part of a decade. The territorial court, once it had reviewed the full extent of the scheme, went further than merely voiding the debts, ordering restitution besides, small sums by the standards of a wealthier territory, but sums that meant, for families who had scraped by on less than they deserved for years, the difference between merely surviving a winter and actually thriving through one. Emmett rode out himself, the morning the court order came through, to tell Martha Ostrander, in person, that the North 40 was hers again, free and clear. She stood in her own yard, reading the document twice through, before she trusted it, and then she sat down hard on the porch step, the paper still in her hand, and cried the particular unashamed tears of a woman who has carried a weight so long she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. 6 years, she said, when she could speak again. 6 years I told myself it was just bad luck, just poor management, just a woman without the sense to keep proper accounts. Never once let myself imagine somebody had done it on purpose. She wiped her eyes with the back of one weathered hand, laughing a little at herself despite the tears. My husband kept telling me not to take it so personal. That land was just land, and we'd manage regardless. I don't think either of us believed it, not really. A man works 40 acres his whole life. Watching it get smaller and smaller, he starts to wonder what exactly he did wrong to deserve the shrinking. It was never you, Emmett said. It was never anything you did. I know that now, she said. Took a stubborn Calloway, riding back into this valley to make me believe it, but I know it now. The Whitfields got their land back the same week, and Daniel Whitfield stood in his own reclaimed field with his son on his hip and wept without trying very hard to hide it, and told Emmett later over coffee at the general store, that he intended to teach the boy someday what it had cost and what it had taken to get it back. The Perrys' well rights were restored not long after, and Old Man Perry, a quiet, weathered rancher who'd said perhaps 10 words total the whole afternoon in the square, rode out to the Callaway place one Sunday that autumn with a cured ham and a jar of his wife's preserves, set them on the porch without much ceremony, and said only, "Owed you this much, at least," before riding off again, leaving Emmett and Suyin to share the meal that evening, in the particular contented silence of two people who understood exactly what the gift had meant, even unspoken. Kessler's $400, no longer needed for a debt that had never truly existed, went instead toward cattle and lumber for a new roof on the barn, and a proper headstone Emmett had carved and set on the rise past the north pasture, where Pruitt finally led him to the spot the storm had claimed 6 years before. Jonas Callaway, beloved father, a man who would not be moved. Emmett stood there a long time, the wind moving soft through the grass, and found that the anger he'd carried into this valley 3 days ago, no, weeks ago now, though it felt like both no time at all and an entire lifetime, had finally, quietly, laid itself down beside the grief. He thought of the pocket watch still ticking on the mantel back at the house, his father's initials worn smooth by a thumb that would never press against them again, and understood that some inheritances aren't land or money at all, just small daily proof that a person's care outlasts the person themselves, ticking on in rooms they'll never walk through again. Pruitt stood a respectful distance back, hat in hand, and Suyin came to stand beside Emmett without a word, her shoulder just barely touching his, the two of them looking out over land that had finally, after 6 terrible years, stopped keeping its worst secret. "He'd have liked you," Emmett said, not turning to her. "My father. He didn't warm to people easy, but he'd have liked you." "I would have liked to know him," Suyin said. "From everything you and Mr. Pruitt have told me, I think we would have understood each other. People who build things quietly and do not always say so out loud." Emmett wasn't the boy who'd left this valley at 23, running from a reputation he'd earned 2 territories over. He wasn't the man who'd ridden back in meaning only to sell and disappear. He was something new, something the valley itself, and the woman standing a respectful distance behind him, and a dead man's foreman, who wasn't dead at all had a hand in making. Pruitt gave his statement to the circuit judge himself, 3 weeks after the square, standing in front of the same courthouse bench in Carson City, where Drummond would later be sentenced, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in 6 years of hiding, after calloused palms. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, a reporter from the territorial paper asked him why he'd waited so long to come forward, and Pruitt considered the question a long moment before answering. "Because I was a coward," he said plain, no dressing on it. "And then I met somebody who wasn't, and it shamed me into remembering I once had been braver than that myself. I'd tell any man carrying a secret that's eating him alive, the shame of speaking it late is a good deal lighter than the shame of never speaking it at all." The ranch got a new name that winter, filed proper and legal at the same land office where Drummond had once sat like a king holding court, the same clerk in the same green eyeshade, processing the paperwork, though he looked up this time and shook Emmett's hand and did not look away again the way he had that first hot afternoon. Callaway Kwan. Emmett had suggested it himself, and Suyin had gone very quiet when she heard it. Quiet in the particular way that meant something had moved in her too deep for easy words. At the small gathering Martha Ostrander insisted on hosting that same week, half the valley crowded it into her newly framed barn to mark the filing. Daniel Whitfield stood and raised a cup of cider and said, plain and a little awkward, that he'd never in his life expected to see a stranger ride into this valley, and leave it better than every family already living in it had managed to leave it themselves. The crowd murmured its agreement, glasses raised all around, and for a moment Emmett found himself, of all things, at a loss for words in front of a room. An unfamiliar feeling, for once known across two territories, for saying very little and meaning every syllable of it. Suans, standing beside Emmett, with her hand resting light on his arm, the first time she'd done so, in front of the whole gathered valley, said only that the land had asked for very little. Only someone willing to stay and listen to what it needed. The barn went quiet a moment at that, the particular quiet of people recognizing a truth larger than the sentence that carried it, before Ezra Cotter thumped his cane and called for more cider, and the evening rolled on warm and easy into the dark. The water rights got settled differently than Drummond ever would have allowed. Shared, fair, formalized with the help of Marshal Hargrove and a circuit judge named Ixenus Whitcomb, who'd taken a personal interest in seeing Drummond's whole rotten scheme unwound properly. Judge Whitcomb rode out to the valley himself that winter to oversee the water agreement signed in person, standing in the same square where Drummond had drawn his pistol and told the assembled families, plain and unhurried, that he had presided over a great many territorial disputes in his years on the benches, and precious few of them had ended with the wronged parties still speaking to one another afterward, let alone helping raise each other's barns. Usually, he said, greed finds a way to turn victims against one another before justice ever gets the chance to sort out who wronged whom. This valley did something considerably harder. It waited for the truth together instead of scrambling each for its own small piece of it. He looked at Emmett a long moment. That's rarer than gold out here, Mr. Calloway. I'd remember it, if I were you, longer than you remember the money. Martha Ostrander, standing near the front of the small gathering, spoke up before anyone else could fill the silence. With respect, Judge, I'd remember it a good deal easier if this valley hadn't needed 6 years, and a stranger riding home to finally get around to it. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd, the particular relieved laughter of people who have earned the right to laugh at their own slowness, now that the worst of it lies behind them. Even Judge Whitcomb allowed himself a small, dry smile. Fair enough, Mrs. Ostrander, he said. Fair enough. The spring-fed creek that ran along that line of cottonwoods one, now serving not just the Calloway Quan Ranch, but the Ostranders, the Whitfields, the Perrys, and the town of Ironwood besides. Ezra Cotter, whose barn still bore its scorch mark like an old scar worn without complaint, took to calling the arrangement the fairest thing this valley had seen in 20 years, and said so to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. It wasn't the fortune Drummond had once imagined it could be, hoarded behind one man's greed. It was better than that. It was enough, shared wide enough that nobody in that valley had to go thirsty to keep somebody else rich. Pruitt stayed on. In the end, in a small room off the kitchen, he insisted on fixing up himself, plank by plank, saying he'd spent 6 years hiding from the sound of his own hammer, and didn't intend to spend whatever years he had left doing the same. He took to rising before dawn, most mornings, same as he had in Jonas Calloway's day, putting coffee on before anyone else in the house had stirred, and Emmett came to find, more mornings than not, that he looked forward to that particular smell drifting through the house. For first light, the small, steady proof of an old man, finally fully home. He and Emmett took to working the fence lines together some mornings, the way Pruitt once had with Emmett's father, neither of them saying much, which suited them both fine. Come the first thaw, the whole valley turned out to raise a new barn on the Ostrander place, the old one having gone to ruin during the years the family had scraped by, on less land and less hope than they deserved. Emmett worked the framing beside Daniel Whitfield, who worked it beside old Ezra Cotter, who worked it beside men who 6 months before would never have thought to lend a hand to a rancher's troubles that weren't their own. The air rang all day with hammers and sawing and the particular cheerful noise of a community remembering, all at once, what it felt like to trust its neighbors again. Suyin worked the rail lines with two of the younger Whitfield cousins, showing them, patient and precise, the same bowline knots Emmett had first noticed on a goat pen fence a lifetime ago. And when Daniel Whitfield asked, laughing, where a rancher's wife had learned knots better than half the men on the crew, Suyin only said, "My father fished a river you have never seen, and let the mystery of it stand, the way she always did, like a small gift she wasn't yet ready to unwrap for strangers." One of the Whitfield cousins, a girl of perhaps 12 with her mother's same stubborn jaw, watched Suyin's hand so closely and asked so many earnest questions that Suyin finally sat her down properly on an overturned crate and taught her the whole sequence start to finish, unhurried, patient, the particular, generous patience of someone remembering what it felt like to have no one willing to teach her anything at all. Martha Ostrander brought food out with the other women, and somewhere, in the noise of hammers and laughter and children chasing each other through stacked lumber, Emmett understood that this, too, was part of what he'd come home to, even if he hadn't known to look for it. Not just a ranch, not just a name cleared or a debt undone. A valley remembering how to be a valley again, instead of a scatter of frightened families each guarding their grief alone. Amos Kessler came through that spring on his way to a shipping contract in Carson City and stood in the yard a long while just looking at the place before he ever said a word. "So this is the valley you nearly gave away for $1,000 and a train ticket," he said, finally, shaking Emmett's hand, at last, properly. The debt between them settled in every way that mattered now, except the paperwork. "Best trade I never made," Emmett said. Kessler laughed, looked around at the cottonwoods, at the mended fences, at Su Yin coming out onto the porch with a pot of tea before he'd even had to ask for one. "I can see that," he said. "I surely can." He was quiet a moment, watching her cross the yard, watching the easy, unhurried way. She and Emmett moved around each other now, like two people who'd stopped needing to exhale comfort with a word. "You know, I spent that whole ride out here trying to remember the last time I saw you settled anywhere longer than a season. Couldn't do it. Not since before Merrill Flats, if I'm honest, and that's a long stretch of years to spend without a place that held on to you." "Didn't expect to find one," Emmett admitted. "Came out here meaning to sever the last thread and be done with it." "Some threads," Kessler said, "aren't meant to be severed, just followed to see where they were always headed." He stayed 3 days, longer than his contract strictly allowed, sharing every meal at the table where Pruitt's note had first been unfolded, and left, promising to return before the next hard winter, a promise Emmett suspected, for the first time in his life, a man might actually intend to keep. Spring came slow and green that year, the way it does after a hard winter, the kind of green that makes even scarred land look like it's forgiving itself for everything it's been through. The creek ran full and clear along its familiar line of cottonwoods, loud enough some mornings to be heard from the porch, a sound Emmett had never once noticed as a boy and now found himself listening for, deliberately, the particular music of water that had finally stopped being a secret worth killing over. Emmett found Su Yin in the yard one morning, hanging washing on the same line where he'd first seen those bright splashes of calico, a lifetime and a season ago. Blue, yellow, and beside them now, without either of them ever quite discussing when it had started. His own denim work shirts hung there like they'd always belonged in that particular company. "Still think I should be gone by the end of the week?" she asked, not turning around, though he could hear the smile in it. "Weeks long past," Emmett said. "Reckon I'll have to think up some new excuse to keep you around." She turned then, looked at him the way she had that very first day, steady, unflinching, weighing something in him that only she could see the shape of. "You do not need an excuse," she said. "I told you already. The land needed a soul in it. And now?" "Now," Suyin said, and there was something soft in it this time, something new and warm, something that hadn't been there in that first hard conversation on the porch. "I think it has too." "You ever think," Emmett said, "about what your father would make of all this? If he could see this valley now?" Suyin considered it, watching the wind move through the cottonwoods, a long moment before answering. "Auntie, I think he would say the river always finds its way, eventually, even through stone. He said that to me once, when I was young enough to think it was only about fishing." She looked at Emmett. "I understand it a little differently now." Emmett crossed the yard to stand beside her. Didn't reach for her hand, not yet. Some things a man learns, not to rush, not after everything this valley had already taught him about patience and about what gets earned instead of grabbed. "I used to think a man proved himself with his fists, or his aim, or how fast folks stepped back when they heard his name," he said. "Took me the better part of a year in this valley to understand it might be the opposite, might be measured in what a man's willing to stay still for, willing to be patient for, even when every old habit in him is hollering to move faster. That is not a small thing to understand," Suyin said. "Some men live a whole life and never manage it." I had good teachers," Emmett said. "A stubborn old ghost who wasn't really a ghost. A father who never said the soft word but meant it anyway. And a woman who told me, the very first day, that a week wasn't the same thing as forever." Suyin looked at him a long, steady moment, the kind of look that seemed to weigh a great deal more than the moment itself could hold. "It has been considerably longer than a week," she said. "I noticed," Emmett said. "Reckon I'm in no hurry to see it end." He just stood there, watching the wash snap gentle in a warm spring wind, watching the green line of cottonwoods stretch bright and alive along a creek that had finally, after 10 hard years and 6 terrible ones before that, stopped keeping its secrets. He'd come back to this valley to bury a memory. Instead, he'd found the beginning of something worth staying for, a valley that had learned, slowly and at real cost, to trust its own neighbors again. A dead foreman who wasn't dead at all, mending fence lines, some mornings with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man finally at peace with his own reflection. A woman who had walked into a stranger's home with nothing but a bundle and a black shawl and built, patient stitch by patient stitch, something neither of them had known to call a family until it had already become one. And somewhere past the ridge, where a headstone stood quiet in the tall spring grass, Emmett liked to think his father understood finally exactly what kind of man his stubborn, runaway son had chosen to become. Not the fastest gun 2 territories had ever rightly feared. Just a man who came home again and stayed, and, when it mattered most, put the gun down instead of picking it up. From the fence line, where he'd been mending a gate hinge that didn't strictly need mending, Silas Pruitt watched the two of them standing together in the yard, unhurried, easy, the wash snapping soft between them, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could rightly remember, something that felt very close to peace. He thought of Jonas Calloway, out checking his stock the night of a storm that should never have taken him. Thought of 6 years spent flinching at every sound that might have been a rider come to finish what that storm had started. Thought of a woman on a depot bench with nowhere left to go, and a boy who'd ridden home meaning only to sell a memory and leave it buried for good. None of it had gone the way any of them had planned. Pruitt supposed that was usually how the important things worked out, if they worked out at all. Not the plan a person set off with. Something else entirely, stitched together out of storms and debts and stubborn refusals. to give up on people who had every reason to be given up on. He turned back to the gate hinge, humming something low and tuneless under his breath, and let the two of them have their quiet moment in the yard, without intruding on it, the way a man learns to do when he has, finally, after a great many wasted years, remembered what it means to be grateful for something he never expected to see again. That, in the end, was the whole of the inheritance worth having.